There exists a single moment in naval history when darkness itself became a weapon, when the sea stopped being a highway and became instead an arena where machines could not see, where men had only the hum of electronics and the frantic beat of their own hearts to guide them through a chaos that would reshape the war in the Pacific. It happened in the first hours of November 2nd, 1943, somewhere in the black waters northwest of Bougainville, and by dawn, everything had changed. Picture, for a moment, not the roar or the flash of battle, but the profound and almost unbearable silence that precedes it. Midnight had come to those waters hours before, and the rain fell in thick, cold sheets onto a surface that lay darker than any moonless night could make it. The American naval task force moving through that darkness was a phantom itself, every light extinguished, every engine throttled to a whisper that only the operators in the fur rooms could hear the true voice of. Above deck, men stood at their stations, in clothes dampened by salt spray and tropical rain, watching horizons they could not see, listening to sounds that lived only in the electronic spaces between their ears and the world. The radar operators in the ships above them, men hunched over glowing green screens in compartments that smelled of hot metal and ozone, and a particular kind of fear that only those who have stood in darkness while others meant to find and kill them can understand. These men were watching something that their eyes could never see. Tiny points of light on glass, moving against the phosphorescent grid. Blips. Echoes from somewhere out in the rain and the black. Not yet real, not yet a threat. Just the whisper of distant metal reflected back at the speed of light. But they were watching, always watching. The salt air that night carried the weight of anticipation. It carried also the exhaustion of men who had been at sea for hours, who had loaded ammunition, and checked weapons, and verified coordinates, until the repetition itself became a kind of prayer. It carried the nervous energy of a task force that knew, with absolute clarity, that it was about to fight. The engines themselves, the great turbines that turned the propeller shafts, thrummed through the hulls of the cruisers and destroyers in a frequency almost below hearing, a vibration felt in the chest and the bones rather than perceived by the ear. That low, constant hum was the heartbeat of steel and steam, and thousands of men held in suspension between the normal world and something far more terrible. And somewhere out there, beyond the rain and the radar's reach in that first moment of awareness, other ships were moving too. Other men were standing at their own stations. Other radar sets, older, less capable, but no less intent, were searching the night. The Japanese force under Admiral Sentaro Omori was coming from the northwest, sailing down from Naval, with a mission that seemed, in the calm logic of tactical planning, perfectly reasonable: disrupt the American landings at Cape Torokina, turn back the invasion, protect the Empire's hold on the Solomon Islands. It all made sense in the maps and the briefing rooms. It all made sense until the moment when two fleets, each invisible to the other save for the electronic ghosts they cast, understood that they occupied the same piece of ocean and could not both hold it. If you found yourself drawn to these moments where history turns on the knife's edge between preparation and chaos, where men who trained for weeks faced seconds that would define their lives, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel. We're building a collection of deeply researched naval history journeys, moments of quiet complexity where radar and courage and the fog of war intersected on dark waters. Each story is written specifically for the particular kind of attention you bring when the world grows quiet. Join us for more nights like this one, where we can sit together with the true experiences of those who lived through the war at sea, without the noise, without the rush. But for now, let us return to that specific hour. The rain continued to fall. The ships continued their silent movements through the corridor of Empress Augusta Bay, that stretch of water that would give its name to this battle, though the men aboard those vessels in that moment had no notion they were making history. They were simply doing what they had been trained to do, moving through darkness, watching the instruments that reached out beyond human sight, waiting for the moment when the wait would end and everything would become urgent and immediate and loud. The November night was cool in a way that tropical nights rarely are. The dampness seemed to penetrate everything, cotton and wool, and the layers of metal that surrounded the men. Some sailors huddled in their battle stations trying to find warmth against the chill and against the particular cold that comes from standing still when you know that motion is coming. Others occupied themselves with small, repetitive actions, checking a gauge, cleaning a sight, adjusting a headset. The human nervous system, confronted with the impossible task of remaining both alert and calm for hours on end, falls back on ritual. The destroyers, those smaller, faster ships that would screen the cruisers and conduct their own terrible ballet with the enemy, were manned by crews whose average age would have shocked anyone old enough to remember peacetime. These were young men, many of them barely more than boys, who had learned their trade not in years, but in months of intensive training. They stood in the gun mounts and the torpedo rooms and the engine compartments, and they waited. The waiting, perhaps, was the hardest part. The waiting for the electronic signals that would transform them from ghosts moving through darkness into weapons engaged with other weapons, in a struggle that would determine not only their own fate, but, in some small but real way, the fate of the war itself. The strategic island-hopping campaign pushed northwestward had made it finally indispensable that Bougainville be taken, held, and garrisoned. The Japanese still held Rabaul to the northwest, still maintained significant air and naval forces there. As long as Rabaul existed as a functioning base, the American advance was threatened, but Rabaul itself could not be easily assaulted. It was too heavily fortified, too well defended. Instead, the strategy called for isolating it, surrounding it with captured territory until its air power and naval power could be neutralized without direct assault. Bougainville was a critical link in that chain, taking the island, securing the bay, establishing the airfields. These were not merely tactical objectives, but the next steps in a long calculus that would eventually lead toward Japan itself. And so the Marines had landed at Cape Torokina that morning, thousands of them pouring from transport ships onto beaches defended, but not heavily enough, by Japanese defenders. By the time darkness fell, the beachhead was established. The Marines were digging in, beginning the endless and exhausting work of creating a foothold on hostile land. But that foothold was fragile. A successful naval counterattack, a force of enemy ships that could break through to the beach, could potentially turn the landings into a disaster, could potentially inflict enough damage on the invasion fleet to force a withdrawal, could potentially send the entire campaign backward. The stakes of the coming night, then, were far higher than any individual sailor standing at his station could fully comprehend, and yet each of them understood, with an instinctive clarity that required no words, that this was a night upon which something consequential would turn. So the ships moved through the rain and the black. The radar screens cast their ghostly light upon the faces of the men who watched them. The engines hummed their patient, relentless song, and somewhere in that darkness, two fleets approached each other with the slow inevitability of objects that have been set in motion toward the same point. Morning had not yet come. The rain continued, and in the quiet hours before dawn, on November 2nd, 1943, the night itself was about to shatter. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet histories, the ones that unfold in darkness and rain, where human decisions ripple across an ocean and echo through generations, there's something worth pausing for. The stories of naval warfare, stripped of their urgency and told with care, have a particular way of settling into the mind. They're not about heroics shouted from a page. They're about the steady hum of radar screens in the night, about men whose names we'll never know, standing watch in compartments deep below the waterline, trusting in systems and each other as the ship around them trembles. If this feels like the kind of journey you want to return to, these deeply researched accounts of the Pacific War, told at a pace that honors both the facts and the weight of what happened, consider subscribing to follow more nights like the one we're about to walk through together. Each episode unfolds in the same way this one will, slowly, with room for you to breathe between thoughts, with attention paid to the small human moments that historians sometimes overlook. We don't rush through the battle. We settle into it. We sit with the men aboard these ships, feel the rain on the deck, hear the voices of officers making split-second choices that would change the course of an island campaign. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay is one of those rare naval engagements where radar, tactics, training, and sheer circumstance collided in the dark. It's a story worth telling carefully, the way it deserves to be told, and there will be more like it, more nights at sea, more decisions made under pressure and silence, more questions about what happened and why it mattered. By subscribing, you're choosing to spend time with history that's been researched, not for speed, but for understanding, the kind that lets you drift towards sleep while learning something true about the world as it was. By the autumn of 1943, the American strategy in the Pacific had begun to take on a rhythm all its own, a slow, methodical advance through the archipelagos of the Southwest Pacific, each island a stepping stone toward a distant but clarifying objective. The Solomon Islands, that long spine of volcanic peaks and jungle-clad shores, stretching northwest from Guadalcanal, had become the highway upon which American power was traveling. And at the northern end of that highway stood Rabaul, a Japanese fortress of such concentration and consequence that it seemed to glow, even in maps and in the minds of strategists in Washington and Pearl Harbor, as the fulcrum upon which the entire war might balance. To understand why the Americans were willing to risk their ships and sailors in the black waters off Bougainville on that November night, one must first understand what Rabaul represented. This was not merely another Japanese outpost, though it was certainly that. Rabaul was the marshalling yard of Japanese air power in the Southwest Pacific, the staging ground from which hundreds of aircraft could be launched against any American advance. It held air bases of formidable capacity, sophisticated supply depots, and naval repair facilities that allowed Japanese ships to return to combat more swiftly than they otherwise might. Most crucially, perhaps, Rabaul represented the deepest Japanese penetration into what Americans had come to regard as their operational sphere. To allow that position to remain unchallenged was to accept the prospect of grinding attrition that might stretch the war in the Pacific into a duration no one truly wished to contemplate. But there was a problem, and it was a problem that had troubled American planners since the summer of that year. Rabaul could not simply be invaded. The island was too heavily fortified, too well garrisoned, and too far from American bases to be taken directly without sustaining losses that the Joint Chiefs of Staff deemed unacceptable. And so another strategy had been devised, one that would come to be called the approach of bypassing and encirclement. The Americans would not attack Rabaul directly. Instead, they would methodically isolate it, cutting off its resupply, dominating the waters and skies around it, and gradually rendering it impotent through a combination of attrition and blockade. This meant moving north through the Solomons. Guadalcanal had been captured in a brutal campaign that lasted 6 months. Then had come New Georgia, seized in fighting that summer, another forward base from which American air superiority could be extended. And now, in early November, the time had come for the next move. Bougainville itself, the largest and northernmost island in the chain, would be assaulted. Bougainville lay close enough to Rabaul that it could serve as an American airbase, yet it was distant enough from Rabaul's principal defenses that it might be seized without absorbing a direct counteroffensive aimed at total destruction. Or so the calculations suggested in those careful planning sessions in air-conditioned rooms far from the ocean. Empress Augusta Bay cuts deeply into Bougainville's eastern shore, a natural harbor of considerable depth and protection, surrounded by coral reefs and jungle that rose steeply from the water's edge. It was here that the American amphibious planners had chosen to land, and here that the Marines of the 3rd Marine Division would establish their beachhead on that November morning. But to land successfully, to get the transports into the bay and the troops onto the beach, the Navy had to maintain control of the waters offshore. The Japanese would certainly attempt to interfere, that was not in doubt. It was merely a question of how they would interfere and when. The strategic moment was paradoxical in its character. The Americans needed the bay, but they could not hold it indefinitely from the sea. They needed to get enough men and supplies ashore quickly enough that they could defend themselves against counterattack. But until they had built up their forces sufficiently, until engineers had cleared fields for airstrips and repair facilities, the Navy's ships would have to hover nearby, vulnerable and vigilant. And Rabaul lay only 200 nautical miles away, close enough that Japanese aircraft could reach the waters off Bougainville and return in a matter of hours. Consider for a moment what this meant for the American naval commanders, who would have to maintain that vigil. They would need to position their ships to intercept Japanese counterattacks by sea, while simultaneously providing gunfire support for the Marines ashore and maintaining enough anti-aircraft firepower to ward off air raids from Rabaul. This was not a problem with a single solution. It was a problem that demanded constant adjustment, constant vigilance, constant calculation of risk and probability. And it all depended, in the end, on the assumption that American ships could prevail in a night battle, in waters where radar and darkness and the human inability to perfectly anticipate enemy movement could all conspire to produce unexpected outcomes. The push up the Solomons had cost the Navy dearly already. In the waters around Guadalcanal and New Georgia, Japanese night tactics had taken their toll. Fast cruisers and destroyers swooping down from Rabaul to strike at night, using their superior training in torpedo warfare and their willingness to fight at close quarters to offset American numerical advantages. The Navy had learned these lessons painfully, and by the autumn of 1943, American commanders had begun to develop countermeasures. They were learning to use radar not merely as a tool for detection, but as the foundation of a new kind of tactical doctrine. They were improving their night fighting procedures, and they were selecting their commanders with an eye toward aggressiveness and tactical innovation. Yet the fundamental question remained unresolved. Could the Americans now dominate the night? Could they seize control of these dark waters through superior technology, superior coordination, and superior willpower? The coming hours would provide an answer, though it would be an answer written in the language of gunnery flashes and sinking ships, in the desperate actions of men struggling to function under conditions of profound uncertainty and profound danger. The bay was secured ashore. The Marines were establishing their perimeter in the jungle. But the sea lanes remained contested, and they would remain contested until one side or the other could demonstrate mastery of the darkness itself. The American ships that would meet them that night had been gathering in the waters south of Bougainville for days, a slowly assembling force of steel and purpose, waiting for the moment when they would be needed. At the helm of this gathering sat Rear Admiral Aaron Stanton Merrill, a man whose reputation had been quietly built through methodical action rather than dramatic gesture. He was the kind of officer who believed in preparation, in knowing his ships and his men, as well as one could know them, in the compressed intimacy of wartime command. His flagship was the light cruiser Montpelier, and from her bridge on the night of November 2nd, he would orchestrate what would become one of the swiftest and most decisive naval engagements of the entire Pacific campaign. The Montpelier herself was a Brooklyn-class cruiser, lean and purposeful, built with the intention of being both swift and formidable. She displaced roughly 6,000 tons of seawater, her hull a product of American industrial precision, her guns arranged with the calculation that comes from generations of naval design. Around her, in a formation that had become almost second nature through weeks of coordination, moved three sister ships, the Cleveland, the Columbia, and the Denver. Each of these cruisers carried the same complement of armament, guns that ranged from the primary 15-centimeter batteries that could hurl shells across vast distances down to the lighter anti-aircraft weapons that bristled from their superstructures like quills on a nervous animal. The Cleveland herself, having joined the fleet more recently, still carried within her the eager quality of a newer vessel, her systems less worn than some of her sisters, her crew perhaps not yet as tempered by months of island warfare. But cruisers, for all their firepower, were never quite meant to sail alone. They required protection, a screen of swifter, smaller vessels that could probe ahead, that could absorb punishment, that could dart in and strike before withdrawing into the darkness. Merrill's destroyer screen was commanded by a man named Arleigh Burke, a name that would become legendary in naval circles, though on this particular night he was simply a destroyer commander with a job to do. The destroyers under his tactical control were fast, modern vessels: the Charles F. Arsburn, the Dyson, the Claxton, and the Spence, each of them built with the understanding that destroyers were instruments of speed and aggression, designed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. These were not ships meant to absorb punishment the way a cruiser might. They were built to strike and maneuver, to think on their feet, to operate in the margins where larger vessels could not venture. There was also the light cruiser Reno in Merrill's force, a smaller cousin to the Montpelier and her sisters, though no less dangerous in her own right. She represented an older generation of cruiser design, a bit smaller perhaps, but no less committed to the night that lay ahead. Together, these ships, the 4 heavy cruisers, the light cruisers, and the carefully screened destroyers, formed what the Navy called Task Force 39. On paper, in the calm orderliness of fleet reports and combat orders, it was simply a designation, a way of organizing effort and responsibility. But to the thousands of men aboard these vessels, the gun crews, the radar operators, the engine room sailors breathing the humid, oily air of the spaces below decks, the signalmen and the lookouts, and the countless others whose names would never appear in any official account, it was something more intimate. It was their formation, their task, their responsibility to see that the landings ashore at Cape Torokina would have the shield they needed. Merrill's plan, as it took shape over the hours preceding the battle, was built on principles that were almost classical in their simplicity. His ships would remain mobile throughout the night, using their radar, that remarkable new technology that could see through rain and darkness, to maintain awareness of the approaching Japanese fleet. He would attempt, if possible, to take up a position that would allow him to interpose his cruisers between the Japanese force and the vulnerable transport ships and landing craft that lay anchored in Empress Augusta Bay. It was not so much a desire for a head-to-head encounter as it was a determination to prevent that encounter from happening where the Japanese wanted it to happen. The destroyers, under Burke's command, would operate on the perimeter, would search for opportunity, would harass and probe, and, when the moment came, would strike with the concentrated violence that destroyers could deliver. There was something almost meditative in the way these crews had trained together. The cruiser captains knew how their ship's gunnery systems worked, knew the specific quirks of their fire control radar, understood the precise moment when their guns could be brought to bear with maximum effectiveness. The destroyer captains had drilled their crews in torpedo attack runs so many times that the motions had become something approaching muscle memory. The engineering officers, deep in their steel cocoons below the waterline, had practiced the sudden accelerations and sharp turns that would be demanded of them. Yet even the best-trained crew cannot fully anticipate the chaos that night battle brings. There is always an element of the unknown, always a moment when theory meets the stunning reality of enemy fire and darkness, and the terrible vulnerability of steel ships on an open sea. As Merrill moved his force into position, as the hours of darkness accumulated before them like an approaching tide, the officers and men aboard these ships were settling into the peculiar mental state that precedes combat. There was no fear exactly, or perhaps there was, but it was a fear so commonplace, so entirely expected, that it barely registered anymore. There was instead a kind of focused attention, a narrowing of consciousness to the task at hand. The radar operators would soon be staring intently at their screens, watching for the pips that would indicate approaching enemy ships. The gun captains were checking and rechecking their ammunition systems. The captain of each vessel had reviewed his orders, understood his role in the larger formation, and was now simply waiting with the patience that only sailors truly understand, for the moment when waiting would become unnecessary. And so, beneath those same dark Pacific skies, a different fleet was already in motion. From the great Japanese naval base at Rabaul, hundreds of miles to the northwest, Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori had received his orders that afternoon, orders that would drive him and his ships southward through the gathering night. The Americans had landed at Cape Torokina. Reports had come in. fragments of intelligence arriving in radio crackles at fleet headquarters, telling of assault craft grinding onto the beaches, of Marines pouring ashore into Bougainville's dense jungle and volcanic earth. To Omori, commanding the cruiser force based in Rabaul, this was unacceptable. The Americans could not be allowed to establish a foothold so close to the Empire's perimeter. The naval response had to be immediate. It had to be overwhelming. Omori was a careful, methodical officer, one of the older breed of Japanese naval commanders who still believed in the power of the surface fleet, in the decisive gun action that battleships and cruisers could deliver in the darkness. He assembled his force with deliberation, not a large fleet by the standards of major engagements, but formidable enough in the shallow waters of the Solomons. At the heart of his striking force were two heavy cruisers, the Myoko and the Haguro. Both were modern ships of the Myoko class, each displacing nearly 10,000 tons and bristling with the long-range 8-inch guns that could hurl shells across vast distances with terrible accuracy. These were flagships in their own right, vessels that had seen action in other theaters, carried the weight of Japanese naval pride and training. The Myoko herself was Omori's flagship, her superstructure a ladder of radar antennae and fire control stations, where officers would plot the coming engagement on charts and mechanical targeting computers. Consider for a moment the confidence that these ships embodied. The Myoko and Haguro had been designed in the late 1920s, refined through the 1930s, and by the autumn of 1943, they represented decades of engineering tradition and naval doctrine. Japanese cruiser captains had trained for exactly this kind of surface action, a night engagement where darkness could be an ally, where the keen eyes of lookouts and the precision of their gunnery would matter more than radar or electronic wizardry. The Americans relied too heavily on their machines, Omori and many of his contemporaries believed. The human eye, the warrior spirit, the will to close with the enemy and destroy him, these could not be replicated by tubes and dials. Alongside the heavy cruisers came the light cruiser Sendai, a smaller, faster vessel that could dart and weave through the melee, adding her 6-inch guns to the opening barrage. She too had seen action before, had survived engagements and weathered damage. Her captain, like so many of the commanding officers in Omori's force, had studied naval warfare since his youth in the Naval Academy. He knew the theory, the geometry of gunnery, the art of maneuvering in darkness. The Sendai would serve as a kind of pathfinder, probing ahead, drawing fire perhaps, allowing the heavier ships to respond with devastating salvos once the enemy was located. And then there were the destroyers, 8 of them, sleek and quick, ranging in size and armament, but all capable of tremendous speed and carrying the deadly burden of torpedoes. These were not brand new vessels, though several were relatively modern. Some, like the Samudare, had already endured considerable action elsewhere in the Pacific, yet each carried officers and men who believed in their ship's luck, in the tradition of destroyer tactics that emphasized aggressive pursuit and massed torpedo attacks at night. Japanese destroyer captains in this phase of the war were learning that submarines and aircraft now dominated many engagements, yet they clung to the notion that a properly executed destroyer assault, fast, coordinated, delivered in darkness, could still turn the tide of a surface action. The composition of this force tells us something about Japanese naval thinking in the autumn of 1943. It was a force built for surface action, for the classical night battle that strategists had contemplated in their war colleges and manuals for decades. It was not a force assembled to contest American air superiority or to defend against sustained air attack. There were no dedicated anti-aircraft ships in great numbers, no shallow draft gunboats designed for close-in beach support. It was a force organized around the assumption that the engagement would be decided by gunnery and maneuver in the darkness, and that American carrier aircraft, based hundreds of miles away, would not be a factor in the initial surface action. Omori's plan, though, was not to sail south as some crushing monolithic force. Instead, he divided his ships into 2 groups. One, built around the 2 heavy cruisers Myoko and Haguro, would represent the main striking force, the ship killers, the vessels that could trade shells with American cruisers and sustain damage while delivering devastating fire in return. The second group, lighter and faster, was organized under Commander Shoji Nishimura, a skilled and aggressive destroyer officer. This force would provide the torpedo threat, the massed attack that could cripple a larger enemy and create the chaos and confusion upon which Japanese naval doctrine relied. As Omori's fleet sailed south from Rabaul that afternoon and evening of November 1st, moving toward the waters off Empress Augusta Bay, there was a certain inevitability to the gathering darkness. The ships moved in a loose formation, respecting the need for spacing and the submarine threat, yet grouped closely enough to support one another when contact came. Lookouts scanned the horizon constantly, aware that they might encounter American cruisers at any moment. Below decks, sailors went about their duties with the familiar rhythms of naval routine, checking ammunition, testing communications, ensuring that the complex machinery of warship operations remained in readiness. Many of them would have known that a major engagement was coming. The gunnery officers briefed the gun crews. The damage control parties drilled their procedures. The radio operators stood by their sets, waiting for transmissions that would announce the sighting of the enemy. There was a tension in the air, palpable and real, yet also tempered by something else, a kind of quiet fatalism. These men, many of them, had been at war for years now. They had seen the initial victories, the rapid expansion of Japanese power across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They had also, increasingly, seen the American response, the carriers rising from Pearl Harbor's waters, the new ships appearing in their intelligence reports with alarming regularity, the sense that despite their training and their devotion to duty, the weight of American industrial might was beginning to press down upon them. Some sailors harbored doubts, others remained committed, believing that superior tactics and the spiritual strength of the Japanese warrior would prevail, and still others simply performed their duties, day after day, night after night, without dwelling too much on the larger currents of the war. As November 2nd began, as the calendar shifted to the day of the actual engagement, Omori's fleet was drawing closer to the waters where American ships waited. Neither side knew with certainty where the other was, though both possessed some form of intelligence about enemy movements. The Japanese naval command at Rabaul believed American ships were present, somewhere in the waters off Empress Augusta Bay. The Americans, for their part, had received warnings of a Japanese response, had moved their forces into position to meet it. What neither side could fully anticipate was the manner in which that meeting would unfold, the speed of the battle, the role that radar would play, the countless small decisions made by commanding officers in the darkness that would ultimately determine who lived and who died, and who could claim victory when the sun rose on November 2nd. The morning of November 1st had broken grey and restless over the waters of the Solomon Islands. While the Japanese commanders were still calculating their response in Rabaul, American forces were executing something that would change the entire calculus of the war in the South Pacific. The soldiers and Marines had begun their assault on Cape Torokina, on Bougainville's western shore, and by the time the sun had climbed to its apex, thousands of young men were wading through the shallow lagoon waters, their rifles held high, their breath clouding in the salt air as they moved toward the black sand beaches. The initial landings had met lighter resistance than intelligence officers had feared. The Japanese garrison in the area was smaller, more scattered than expected, and the Americans pressed their advantage, moving inland, digging in, establishing a perimeter that would soon contain an entire airfield and support the next phase of the island-hopping campaign toward the Japanese heartland. But those Marines and Army engineers who had splashed ashore that morning, carrying their supplies and their exhaustion, were now dependent on something they could not see and would never touch directly. They were dependent on the sea itself, remaining under American control. And as dusk fell and darkness gathered again, that responsibility fell entirely to Aaron Merrill and the men aboard the cruisers and destroyers of Task Force 39. Consider for a moment what it meant to hold a beach in the face of an enemy who still commanded formidable naval power. The Marines ashore had secured perhaps a few miles of coastline, a foothold barely established. Their supply lines stretched like gossamer threads across the open water. Every ammunition round, every ration, every medical kit, every replacement for the men who would inevitably fall, had to come across the water from the support ships anchored just offshore. The Japanese knew this. They understood that an amphibious landing is perhaps the most vulnerable moment in warfare, when troops are ashore but not yet strong enough to defend themselves, when they are utterly dependent on continued resupply. If the Japanese Navy could fight its way through to those beaches that night, if they could bombard the landing zone and destroy the supply ships standing sentinel offshore, the entire operation could collapse. The Marines would be cut off, isolated. The advance toward Rabaul would stall. And so the Navy, those steel ships with their young officers and sailor crews, had to interpose themselves between the enemy and the vulnerability of those men on the beach. They had to be present. They had to be ready. They had to be willing to contest the darkness itself. The transport ships and cargo vessels that had delivered the assault waves were now moving slowly offshore, their holds emptied of men, but still laden with ammunition and supplies. The cruisers of Task Force 39 had taken positions in what would become known as Empress Augusta Bay, a stretch of dark water bounded by Bougainville on one side and smaller islands on the other. It was not ideal terrain for a naval battle. The bay itself was shallow in places, studded with shoals and reef formations that existed more as rumors on the charts than as certainties. It was the kind of place where a ship could run aground as easily as it could be sunk by enemy fire. But it was where the Marines were, and therefore it was where the Navy had to stand. Merrill had positioned his cruisers in a rough line formation, with the destroyers screening ahead and to the flanks, ready to intercept any Japanese approach. The men aboard these ships knew what was coming. Intelligence had reported Japanese warships sailing south from Rabaul. They did not know the exact composition of the enemy force, did not know the precise moment of arrival, but they understood the general outlines of what the night would demand. They had spent the afternoon and early evening preparing. Ammunition had been checked and rechecked. Fire control officers had refreshed themselves on the tactical doctrine they would need to employ in darkness. Damage control parties had reviewed their stations and rehearsed their procedures. The men who would operate the guns had rested when they could, and now waited in the deepening twilight for the orders that would send them to battle stations. What strikes one, when studying this particular moment in the war, is how the rhythm of a naval engagement can seem almost meditative in its deliberation, even as its stakes remain mortal. The ships were not moving frantically, there was no panic. The American sailors had been trained to operate under fire, had absorbed the protocols and procedures that allowed dozens of men to function in unison aboard a warship, each doing his specific task without needing to see the larger picture. The gun captains knew their responsibilities. The damage control teams knew theirs. The radar operators were already at their stations, green screens glowing softly in the gathering darkness, watching the electromagnetic reflections that would soon tell them the Japanese were coming. There was a waiting quality to it all, a suspended moment between the daylight world of the landings, where men could see the shapes of the islands and the faces of their companions, and the night world that was about to begin. In perhaps an hour, maybe two, the character of warfare would shift entirely. The battle would be fought not with human eyes but with electronic pulses, not with tactics designed for daylight maneuvering, but with procedures for rapid fire in conditions of near total obscurity. It would be a test, not of courage, for that would be demanded of all, but of discipline and training, and the ability to execute orders with precision when visibility was reduced to almost nothing. The Marines ashore that night were largely unaware of the naval drama that was about to unfold. They were consolidating their positions, digging defensive works, establishing supply dumps inland where they would be somewhat protected from naval bombardment. Some of them would have heard rumors that enemy ships were on the way, that a battle was expected offshore, but for the most part, they were focused on the immediate tasks of establishing their beachhead. They trusted, as soldiers and Marines have always had to trust, that the Navy would do what the Navy does, and what the Navy was about to do, on that rain-swept night off Bougainville was to hold the line between enemy and ally with everything at their command. Every gun aboard Merrill's cruisers was ultimately in service of those men on the beach. Every torpedo that would be fired, every shell that would be launched, every evasive maneuver executed in the darkness was part of a larger effort to keep the supply lines open, to keep the Japanese away from the vulnerable landing zone, to ensure that the foothold gained on Bougainville that morning would be held and eventually expanded. The sea itself, black and restless under the night sky, was about to become the boundary of human will, and when the darkness came complete, when the rain squalls thickened, and the first radar contacts appeared on the screens of American fire control officers, that boundary would be tested in ways that would linger in the memory of every man aboard those ships for the remainder of his life. Now, before those first shells began to fall across the dark water, it is worth pausing for a moment to consider something invisible yet profoundly consequential, something that existed not in steel or ammunition, but in electromagnetic waves traveling outward from the tips of tall antennas, and in the green phosphorescent traces that bloomed across radar screens in darkened combat information centers deep within the American ships. The men peering into those screens at this very hour represented a kind of quiet revolution in naval warfare, one that had only truly matured in the previous 2 years. What had once been theoretical, the notion that you could see an enemy force in complete darkness, through rain and mist, at ranges where the human eye would perceive nothing but void, had become, by November of 1943, an operational reality that no Japanese admiral could fully account for. The American cruisers and destroyers moving through Empress Augusta Bay that night carried, among their many instruments of war, a technological advantage that would remain largely unknown to the Japanese command structure until far too late. These were the SG radar sets, surface search radar systems that had been installed aboard American warships beginning in the summer of 1942. They were not perfect instruments. They could be temperamental in heavy rain. They required constant calibration and vigilant operators who understood that a blip on a green screen was not a certainty but a probability, a suggestion of where an enemy might be, refined through geometry and calculation and human intuition. Yet they represented something for which the opposing force had no adequate counter. Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori, commanding the Japanese force sailing south from Rabaul, possessed no comparable technology. His ships would rely, as they had for centuries, on the oldest of naval senses, eyesight, sound, the intuition of experienced lookouts straining against the darkness. Consider, for a moment, the profound asymmetry this created. In the hours just before midnight on November 2nd, American radar operators aboard the Montpelier, the flagship of Task Force 39, were already detecting the approach of the Japanese force, not as vague rumors or radio intercepts, but as actual physical returns, solid blips that represented the displacement of the Myoko, the Haguro, and the attendant destroyers. They could estimate bearing and range with a precision that would have seemed impossible merely a year before. They could track multiple targets simultaneously. They could watch as formations turned, as distances closed, as the engagement geometry shifted in real time. And crucially, they could do all of this in complete darkness, under cloud cover so thick that moonlight became irrelevant, in rain squalls that would have rendered any conventional visual search entirely futile. Yet the radar sets themselves represented something more than mere technological superiority. They embodied a different philosophy of naval warfare, one that privileged information and calculation over the headlong courage and individual initiative that had characterized so much of prior naval combat. An American cruiser captain making use of radar data was, in a sense, an extension of a broader grid of sensing and communication. His decisions emerged not from the isolation of his own bridge and the limits of his own senses, but from a continuous feed of information that connected him to his radar operators, to his gunnery officers, to the broader tactical picture being assembled by Rear Admiral Merrill's staff aboard the Montpelier. This was less romantic, perhaps, than the image of the warrior captain deciding the battle through bold intuition and personal courage. It was also, from a purely military perspective, considerably more lethal. The SG radar that was proving so consequential that night had been developed through a combination of civilian radio expertise and naval engineering, refined in the crucible of earlier Pacific battles. It operated at a wavelength of about 10 centimeters, short enough to provide reasonable resolution, yet long enough to penetrate modest amounts of rain and sea clutter. The antenna itself was a relatively modest affair, a rectangular array mounted on the mast or superstructure, rotating continuously and sweeping out an electronic net across the surrounding ocean. Each rotation took perhaps 10 seconds, painting the same area of sea again and again, building up a persistent image in the minds of the men who watched. The display itself, the plan position indicator, as it was known, presented the ocean as a circle of pale light, with the ship's position at the center and all returns arrayed around it. Hostile, friendly, or doubtful, this was the question that occupied the radar operator's entire attention. What made the American radar advantage particularly consequential in this specific engagement was its range. An SG radar set could detect a cruiser at distances of 15 to 20 nautical miles or more, depending on atmospheric conditions and the specific design of the set being used. This meant that Admiral Merrill's force could detect the approaching Japanese well before the Japanese could detect them, and the advantages that flowed from this temporal advantage were manifold. There was time to adjust course, to position the American ships to best tactical advantage, to begin preparing gunnery solutions before the enemy even knew they were being approached. There was time for the American cruisers and destroyers to achieve favorable positioning, what the tacticians called crossing the T, getting a position where one's own broadsides could rake the enemy, while the enemy's return fire would be masked or limited. The Japanese, by contrast, were operating in a condition of relative blindness, relying on what their lookouts could report, on the patterns of radio traffic they might intercept, on educated guesses about where the American force might be. They were brave men, well-trained and experienced in many cases, commanding ships that were in many respects superior to their American counterparts, faster, more heavily armored, carrying in some cases more formidable guns. Yet in this particular night, in this particular engagement, their courage and their ship's qualities would be operating under a fundamental handicap: the fog of war, that ancient condition that has so often defined the outcome of battles, would be significantly less opaque for one side than for the other. It was a peculiar kind of revolution, this one written in the language of electromagnetic theory and phosphorescent display tubes. No great fleets had yet been decisively defeated by radar alone. There were still battles to be won and lost through good seamanship and disciplined gunnery and the courage of individual sailors under fire. Yet the advantage that radar conferred, the ability to see in the darkness, to know where the enemy was, even when the enemy did not know where you were, would prove, in the coming hours, to be quite decisive indeed. The men aboard the American ships, for all that they could not have articulated it in these technological terms, sensed that they possessed something precious. They carried an eye that never blinked, that never tired, that could perceive the enemy in conditions where human senses failed utterly, and in that perception lay the seeds of tactical advantage that would, eventually, shape the course of the engagement still to come. The hours between dusk and the first radar contact were not marked by roaring engines or shouted orders, but rather by a kind of mechanical silence, the steady, almost meditative rumble of ships slipping through darkness, their engines throttled back to conserve fuel and muffle the sound of their approach. Task Force 39 moved through the waters off Empress Augusta Bay in a careful formation, each vessel black against the black, their running lights extinguished, their superstructures draped in the deep navy of a moonless night. The rain squalls that rolled across the Solomon Sea came intermittently, thick and cold, reducing visibility to mere ship lengths ahead, and the men aboard the American cruisers and destroyers had learned to move by feel as much as by sight. by the wake of the ship ahead, by the compass bearing whispered through sound-powered phones, by the faint phosphorescence of spray against the hull. On the bridge of the Montpelier, Admiral Merrill stood with quiet stillness, his officers arrayed around him in practiced positions. There was no pacing, no visible anxiety. The radar operators below decks in their small compartments, men whose eyes had adjusted to the cold glow of their CRT screens, maintained their vigil over the vast emptiness surrounding them. The SG radar sets hummed their low-frequency song, the antenna rotating steadily, sending pulses of electromagnetic energy out into the night, and listening for the echoes that would tell them whether death was approaching or whether the darkness ahead remained only darkness. It was a strange kind of vigilance, this watching of a screen. For centuries, naval warfare had been conducted by human eyes and experience, by the ability to read the horizon and smell the wind. But on this night in November 1943, a handful of sailors sitting in darkened rooms with radar scopes before them held in their hands the knowledge of what was coming, and they did not yet know it. The crews moved about their assigned tasks with the subdued efficiency of men who had done this many times before, though the weight of tonight felt somehow different. The Marines were ashore now. Real men were in the jungle with nothing but darkness and uncertainty between them and the Japanese forces they knew were somewhere in the interior. The Navy's job was simple and absolute. Keep the enemy ships away until dawn. Keep them away until air cover could be established, until the beachhead could be consolidated and the supply lines secured. The crews understood this without being told. It was understood in the way a man understands hunger or thirst, as a fundamental condition of the moment. In the gun crews below, ammunition was checked and rechecked. The 5-inch guns were trained toward the horizon, pointing into the rain and night like blind fingers feeling their way through unfamiliar rooms. The men who served these guns knew their positions by heart: the loader, the rammer, the sight setter, the trainer. They stood in near total darkness, connected to the fire control center above by sound-powered phones that transmitted only whispered voices. The captain spoke to the gunnery officer, who spoke to the turret officers, who relayed commands down into the depths of the ships where other men waited, ready to unleash the mechanical fury that only the United States Navy could produce. But for now, they waited. They waited in the darkness and the sound of the sea and the engines rumble, their hands on the firing mechanisms that might or might not be needed. The lookouts were a breed apart, these men stationed high on the masts and in the crow's nests, their eyes strained against a night so complete it seemed almost tangible. They were trained to see in darkness the way bats hear in silence, by sensitivity, by the smallest variation in the gradation of black. What did they look for, these sentries of the invisible? The flash of a gun? The rise of a wave that might indicate a ship's bow cutting through water? The distant glow of a funnel or a radar antenna catching stray light? On most nights, they saw nothing but cloud and sea spray and the play of their imagination. On some nights, they saw death approaching. How did they know the difference? How did anyone know? The sonar operators, then called soundmen, moved through their own quiet work, their earphones fitted tight over their heads as they listened to the ocean's symphony of noise. The sea was never silent. It was filled with the sounds of ships, of distant explosions, of whale song and fish movement, and the friction of water against hull. They had trained for months to distinguish the rhythm of a Japanese destroyer's propellers from that of an American one, to recognize the particular acoustic signature of enemy ships, the way a mother recognizes the cry of her child among 100 others. Tonight, they listened and heard nothing but the familiar sounds of their own formation, the whisper of their own engines, the soft splash of rain on the water. But they listened as if their lives depended on it, because somewhere in their bones, they knew that they did. The destroyers screening the cruisers were positioned in a loose cordon, their captains in contact with Admiral Merrill by radio, their crews similarly blacked out and silent. These were faster, lighter ships, more agile in the darkness, and they carried their own radar sets, their own crews of young men watching green screens. The destroyers were the sentries, the first to make contact, the first to suffer the consequences of that contact. There was a kind of stoicism among destroyer crews, born from the knowledge that their ships were smaller, faster, more expendable. They would see the enemy first, and they would have to fight first, and many of them would not see dawn. The rain continued, and the formation pressed onward through the night. Behind them, the invasion beaches were settling into an uneasy darkness of their own, the Marines digging in, establishing perimeters, waiting for the counterattack they knew was coming. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond the reach of human sight, Admiral Amori's task force was also moving through the darkness, also driven by the same mechanical necessity, also carrying men whose eyes were straining and whose hearts were beating with anticipation. Two forces, each invisible to the other, each equipped with the latest instruments of war, were sailing toward an encounter that would be decided not by the traditional virtues of seamanship and courage alone, but by mathematics, by physics, by the strange new technology that allowed a man to see in darkness and fire upon enemies he could not observe with his own eyes. The waiting continued. The hours passed with the sluggish inevitability of deep night, marked only by the slow rotation of the clock face and the gradual accumulation of tension that no amount of training can fully prepare a man to endure. There is a particular quality to the waiting before battle, a suspension of normal time, where a few hours can feel like days, and a single moment can contain the weight of years. The men aboard Task Force 39 inhabited that strange temporal space, neither sleeping nor fully awake, their consciousness sharpened to an almost unbearable keenness by the knowledge that something was approaching through the darkness, something that would transform this patient vigil into violence and confusion and the ancient chaos of naval combat. They did not know when it would happen. They did not know exactly what they would face. They knew only that it was coming, that they had been positioned here to stop it, and that in the green glow of radar screens, and in the practiced positions of gun crews, and in the straining eyes of lookouts, they had already begun the process of trying to see what could not be seen, to strike what could not be touched, to survive what had not yet been fully understood. The rain fell harder as the night deepened, sheets of it sweeping across the dark waters in waves that seemed to erase the horizon entirely. The American cruisers and destroyers moved through these squalls in near total silence, their captains and radar operators locked in a state of keen, almost meditative alertness. The ships themselves were already at general quarters, every man at his post, every system humming with ready precision. And then, at approximately 2:35 in the morning, the radar screens aboard the flagship Montpelier flickered with the unmistakable shape of something large moving through the rain from the northwest. It was Rear Admiral Amori's force, now perhaps only 20,000 yards away and closing steadily through the darkness. The distance in those moments felt immeasurable, far enough that the human eye could see nothing but the void of the night ocean, yet close enough that the radar operators could track each ship's movement with an almost intimate precision. The American radar sets, the new SG models installed in the modern cruisers, rendered the approaching enemy not as shadows or rumors, but as distinct electronic signatures, tiny moving pips of light against the darkness of the screen. It was a strange kind of vision, this ability to see without light, to know without seeing. The Japanese vessels had no equivalent. Their radar technology lagged behind, and they were sailing through the night without that invisible eye watching them approach. Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill had moments to make a decision that would shape the entire encounter. He was a man trained in the old art of naval warfare, in the geometry of gunnery and the mathematics of positioning, yet now he possessed an advantage that no admiral in any previous century had ever held: the power to see his enemy in complete darkness, before the enemy could see him. What he did with that knowledge in the next few minutes would determine whether Task Force 39 would fight from a position of strength or vulnerability. Merrill's choice was elegant in its tactical purity. Rather than steam directly into the enemy's path, where the heavier Japanese cruisers might bracket his own light cruisers in a furious exchange of salvos, he chose to maneuver his force westward and slightly northward. The intent was deliberate. By shifting his position, he could bring his cruisers across the probable track of Amori's approach, what sailors called crossing the T. This ancient configuration, perfected in earlier centuries of warfare, would allow the American ships to fire broadsides of all their guns toward the enemy, while the approaching Japanese vessels could only answer with their forward guns, a tremendous advantage in volume and rate of fire. The geometry of it was almost seductive in its simplicity. The orders rippled through the task force as silently as the signals could be transmitted. The cruisers Montpelier, Cleveland, Columbia, and Denver began their careful turn, their rudders shifting with the precision of surgeon's instruments. Every man aboard felt that shift, felt the ship lean slightly as it carved its new path through the rain-dark water. The destroyers screening ahead adjusted their positions as well, maintaining their protective perimeter while the cruisers maneuvered. There was no dramatic acceleration, no sudden violent movement. Everything happened with the controlled deliberation of a ballet performed in complete darkness, each ship knowing where it should be, trusting instruments and training rather than sight. The destroyer captains, commanding the screens and picket line, understood their role intimately. They would be the first to intercept any Japanese torpedo attacks. They would be the ones racing into the darkness to meet an enemy they could not yet see, relying on their own sonar and radar, but mostly on instinct, honed by months of this grinding, exhausting campaign. Some of them were quite young, these destroyermen. Some had never seen combat before tonight, though you would not have known it from the steady professionalism with which they handled their vessels. As the American ships continued their slow, inexorable turn, the radar operators aboard Montpelier kept their eyes fixed on the approaching pips. The Japanese were still moving toward them, still unaware of exactly where the American force lay. Merrill had perhaps 5 more minutes before the range would close to the point where visual contact became possible, where the first gun flashes would light up the rain and transform everything. 5 minutes to position, to arrange his ships into the configuration he wanted, to prepare for an encounter that would be determined in the span of perhaps 30 frantic minutes of violent noise and flame. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath. The rain continued its methodical drumming on the steel decks. The engines of the ships hummed with steady power, driving them across waters that held no mercy and offered no commentary on what was about to unfold. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, the Japanese admiral was making his own calculations, receiving his own reports, preparing to defend his honor and his orders. But Merrill held the invisible advantage. He could see, the enemy could not. In that single, immeasurable fact lay the seeds of everything that would happen in the next hours. The trajectory of shells through darkness, the courage of men in confined spaces, the terrible calculus of naval war, reduced to its essential elements: position, firepower, and the knowledge of where to aim in the blind night. The American cruisers settled into their new course, steady and sure. The moment of opening contact was now only minutes away. When the first contacts bloomed on the radar screens of the American cruisers in those pre-dawn minutes, the crews felt the shift like a held breath finally released. The green phosphorescent blips that had appeared so distant, so manageable in their orderly progression across the scope, now began to multiply and scatter as the Japanese destroyer screen broke formation. The signal to general quarters rippled through the darkened ships, and men who had stood in readiness for hours suddenly found their hands moving with practiced urgency, fingers checking ammunition belts, voices calling out bearing and range in the measured tones that years of drill had etched into memory. Admiral Merrill's tactical vision was to hold his cruisers in a tightly coordinated formation while letting his destroyers range forward. But as the first star shells climbed into the night sky, that careful choreography began to fragment into something far more primal, the ancient chaos of ships trying to kill each other in the dark. The opening salvo came not from the main batteries of the cruisers, but from the destroyers of Merrill's screen, and in those first seconds of muzzle flash and shell trajectory, something curious happened. The light from the star shells, those brilliant magnesium-bright orbs that hung suspended above the water like artificial moons, revealed not one enemy formation, but what appeared to be two, sometimes three, separate groups of ships, each maneuvering independently. American fire control officers found themselves wrestling with a fundamental problem: which targets were real, which were echoes on the radar, and which were friendly ships obscured by smoke and the glare of their own gunfire. A shell fired at what seemed a certainty based on radar bearing would arrive at coordinates where nothing now floated, because the Japanese ships, knowing they were being tracked, were turning hard to port or starboard, their captains calling out steering commands even as American rounds splashed nearby, geysers of white water rising and collapsing into the dark sea. The Japanese responded with their own fury, and this was perhaps the most disorienting moment for many of the American sailors. The realization that they were not simply firing at distant, unseen targets anymore, but that the enemy was firing back, accurately, with shells that screamed overhead or struck with the terrible finality of exploding steel. Near misses on the heavy cruiser, Denver sent showers of spray across her decks, soaking the gun crews and the control stations where officers tried to maintain some thread of understanding through the fog of war. One moment you were tracking a bearing, calling out coordinates with the calm authority of routine, and the next, the world tilted as concussion waves from nearby shell bursts rippled through the superstructure. How do men maintain their composure in such moments, when the instruments of precision suddenly become tools of chaos? The torpedo attacks added another layer of confusion to the night. Japanese destroyers, unable to match American firepower in a direct gun duel, were launching long-lance torpedoes, those remarkable 24-inch weapons that could run 40,000 yards and carry a warhead equal to the detonation of a small building. The problem was that torpedoes, unlike radar blips, announced themselves only when it was nearly too late. Lookouts would suddenly shout warnings of white water trails visible against the darker sea, and commanding officers would ring for hard rudder, hoping to slip their hulls between the oncoming threats. The Cleveland twisted hard to port, her hull groaning with the stress of violent maneuver, and watched as a torpedo track crossed so close that sailors swore they could have thrown a shell casing at it. Did that near miss come from Haguro, from one of the Japanese destroyers, or from a weapon fired by a cruiser operating miles away in the smoke and darkness? In the moment of evasion, there was no time to wonder. There was only the primitive human response to the primal question that every sailor on both sides was asking: would today be the day I die? The American destroyers, meanwhile, were weaving through the chaos like predatory fish, attempting to press their own torpedo attacks while laying down screens of gunfire that sometimes seemed to exist more for the psychological benefit of action than for any clearly observable effect on the enemy. In the rain and smoke, with the wind pushing clouds of cordite and steam across the water, visibility sometimes contracted to mere hundreds of yards. Ships would emerge from the murk suddenly, so close that both crews could see muzzle flashes reflecting off opposing hull plates, and then one side would turn hard, disappearing back into the obscurity as quickly as it had emerged. The Japanese destroyer captains were calling course changes based on visual sightings or on the guidance of radio-directed fire control, but increasingly they found themselves fighting blind, their own radar capabilities far inferior to what the Americans possessed. The Americans, by contrast, had the advantage of seeing the enemy even when the rain and smoke made optical spotting nearly impossible, though translating that electronic ghost of a ship into actual gunfire remained a terrible art, half skill and half luck. In the space of perhaps 15 minutes, the orderly formations with which both battle groups had entered the fight had dissolved into something resembling a three-dimensional chess game played in absolute darkness by participants who could see only shadows and traces. Shells were flying in multiple directions, some between American destroyers and Japanese destroyers, some between cruisers separated by miles of rain-swept ocean, some seemingly aimed at targets that had already moved or that didn't exist at all. A shell fired from the Montpelier at coordinates provided by radar operators would miss by a quarter mile, and in the moment between the firing and the impact, those 7 or 8 seconds that felt like an eternity, the Japanese ship would have already changed course. Yet statistically, over the course of hours, those misses would gradually tighten. The Americans would slowly find the range, their radar operators growing more confident in their readings, their gun captains more familiar with the peculiarities of their weapons. But in this first violent exchange, there was only confusion, the terrible confusion of two fleets trying to destroy each other in conditions where visibility, certainty, and the basic ability to distinguish friend from foe all seemed negotiable concepts. The night was thick with sound and light, and the smell of burning metal, and for the men inside those ships, time seemed to move both too quickly and far too slowly. The first true violence of the night came not as a crescendo, but as a sudden, irreversible cascade of destruction. The American cruisers had the Japanese formation in their radar net now, the green lines and blips coherent on their screens, in a way the Japanese operators, lacking the same technology, could only guess at. It was this silent asymmetry that would reshape the next few minutes into something neither side had quite anticipated. The Sendai, Rear Admiral Omori's light cruiser, had taken position on the near flank of the Japanese column as it pressed southward through the rain, and she carried with her a crew of perhaps 900 men who had no way of knowing, in those final moments before contact, that they were sailing toward their ship's last dawn. They could hear the American guns opening fire in the distance, could feel the vibration through the steel decking, could see the white flashes cutting through the wet darkness like distant lightning, and then, in a span of seconds that would feel eternal to those who survived it, the trajectory of their entire vessel changed forever. The shells came in from the American cruisers Cleveland and Montpelier with a trajectory calculated not by human eye, but by machines, reading the radar returns and feeding firing solutions to gun crews who had rehearsed this moment in daylight 1,000 times over. When the first salvo struck the Sendai amidships, the impact registered not just as noise, but as a violent tearing of the ship's structure, a rending of metal and flesh that sent shockwaves through every compartment. Some of the younger sailors described it later, those who lived to describe anything at all, as feeling like the entire ship had been lifted momentarily from the water and dropped. The force of the strike ruptured steam lines and water pipes, and suddenly the interior passages of the vessel were filling with scalding vapor, and men were screaming in compartments that had become ovens in the space of a breath. The crew of the Sendai faced a peculiar and almost incomprehensible terror in those first moments after the hits. There was no gradual transition from safety to danger, from routine night watch to battle stations. There was only the sudden knowledge that the ship was dying around them, that the vessel they had maintained and lived within was becoming their trap. Below decks, in the engine rooms and fire control stations, men working by gauge light and emergency lanterns felt the ship shudder, felt the stern of the vessel begin to settle, and began the desperate business of trying to save a ship that could not be saved. Above, on the exposed decks, the crew moved into the strange stillness that sometimes follows catastrophe. There was no order, no coordinated evacuation plan that survived the first moment of impact. There was only the knowledge that the Sendai was no longer a warship, but a sinking platform in the middle of a rain-soaked night, surrounded by enemies both real and imagined. The fires spread quickly through the starboard side, orange and red flames climbing into the darkness, casting shadows across the rain-slicked decks that made distance impossible to judge. Men who had trained for years in damage control found that their training, however thorough, counted for almost nothing when the fires were this severe and the flooding this extensive. In the radio compartment, operators continued sending messages, their hands moving across the keys even as they knew the ship was doomed, passing information about their position and condition to other Japanese vessels, still hoping somehow that the nightmare might reverse itself. In the medical sections, doctors and corpsmen worked by flashlight to tend to the wounded, but there were far too many wounded and far too little time, and soon they too abandoned their stations and moved toward the upper decks. The strange paralysis that can grip a sinking ship took hold of the Sendai now. She was no longer maneuvering under her own power, no longer fighting back effectively against the American guns. She was simply present in the darkness, a dying thing, offering no serious resistance, and the American gunners, now able to read her condition through their radar, began directing their fire with the focused attention of men who could sense they had mortally wounded their opponent. More shells came in, striking the superstructure and the forward gun turrets, and the ship began to list slightly to starboard, that first indication that the balance of water and air within her hull was shifting irreversibly. When a listing ship begins to tip beyond a certain angle, it gathers a terrible momentum of its own, as if gravity itself is accelerating toward a conclusion that cannot be delayed or prevented. The decision to abandon ship crystallized gradually in the mind of the Sendai's captain, though in the noise and confusion and darkness, it is difficult to say precisely when the order was given or when it was understood. Sometime in those chaotic minutes after the worst of the hits, word began to spread through the ship that men should make their way topside, that the Sendai could not be held. This word traveled through passageways filled with smoke and steam, was shouted down companionways where electrical lighting had failed, and men moved by the orange glow of fires that were consuming their ship from within. Above, topside, the crew gathered on the listing decks while the rain continued to fall, while the sounds of gunfire and explosions continued somewhere in the greater darkness, and while the stern of the ship continued its slow descent into the water. Some men had life jackets, others did not. Some had been trained in survival in the water. Others had not. All of them faced the question of whether to jump into waters they could not see, in rain and darkness, with no certainty of rescue and every possibility of death. The Sendai's final minutes came at last, though the exact time is difficult to determine from the historical record. What is clear is that her list increased, that her bow rose slightly as her stern became heavier with water, and that at some point in the early morning darkness of November 2nd, 1943, she rolled to starboard and began her descent into the depths of Empress Augusta Bay. For some of the crew, still on her decks, this meant sliding into the water as the angle became too steep to hold. For others already in the water, it meant the terrible moment of seeing the ship's hull pass above them, of feeling the suction of the sinking vessel, of struggling to get clear before being pulled down. In the darkness, in the rain, in the noise and confusion of a battle still raging around them, the sailors of the Sendai faced their individual moments of crisis and survival. The ship was gone within minutes, though to those who experienced it, time moved with the strange elasticity that danger produces. What had been a presence on the water, a grey shape with guns and engines and a hierarchy of officers and crew, was simply no longer there. Where it had been was water. Where had been the certainty of a ship beneath your feet was now only the cold possibility of the sea. Some men found debris, pieces of the Sendai that floated, rafts and wooden spars and wreckage that could be clung to. Others simply floated, their life jackets holding them up while the rain continued to fall, and they awaited whatever came next. The noise of the battle continued around them, the flashes of gunfire still visible, the sounds of other ships firing and being fired upon, still echoing across the water. The sinking of the Sendai had taken perhaps 15 minutes from first hit to final disappearance beneath the surface. In those 15 minutes, something irreplaceable had been lost, and something had been earned by the men who had lived through it, and something had been taken from all of them forever. In the confusion of those opening moments, as shells burst in the darkness and searchlight beams cut white cracks across the rain-drenched water, the Japanese destroyer Samidare found herself caught in a circumstance as perilous as any enemy salvo. Running blacked out through the same murky sea, threading between her own formations and the thundering guns of the cruiser line ahead, she collided with the destroyer Shiratsuyu. The impact itself was not catastrophic, not the sort of shattering blow that sinks a ship outright, but it was a moment that speaks to something we might easily overlook when we think of naval battle. The darkness that concealed these ships from enemy eyes became for a moment the enemy itself. You see, radar gave the Americans a peculiar advantage that November night, a technological eye that could pierce through rain and smoke. But the Japanese ships, lacking comparable sets, relied on visual sighting and the ancient art of ship handling in formation. They knew these waters. Many of their captains and deck officers had sailed these routes before, yet when the gunfire started, when the first shells landed and threw up geysers of spray and shattered metal, when the night fractured into chaos, that familiarity became almost meaningless. A destroyer moving at combat speed through a rain squall, her captain trying to position her to attack while avoiding his own allied vessels, her signal lights darkened for fear of giving away position. These were the conditions that bred accidents, as surely as they bred heroic action. The collision between Samidare and Shiratsuyu lasted only seconds, that awful grinding moment when hull struck hull beneath the surface, when men below decks felt the shudder and wondered if the next enemy shell had found them at last. No, it was not the enemy. It was proximity, speed, and the impossibility of perfect coordination when you cannot use searchlights, cannot risk radio chatter that might be intercepted, cannot see your own ships clearly even as you maneuver among them. Samidare pulled away, her hull damaged but still capable of fighting, still able to steam and turn and add her guns to the melee. But the moment itself lingers in the historical record as a small, telling truth. In the accounts written afterward, in the logs and the memoirs of men who survived that night, you find again and again this recognition that battle at sea in darkness was not simply about who shot first or who had better gunnery. It was about managing the fundamental chaos of dozens of ships, each moving independently, each trying to both protect itself and strike the enemy, each captain working with incomplete information and the ever-present awareness that an accident might be as deadly as a torpedo. The Japanese Navy, for all its training and all its tactical brilliance in daylight engagements, had not fully grappled with what it meant to fight in conditions where you could not see your own hand in front of your face, where the rattle of your own guns and the thunder of explosions all around you made communication nearly impossible. Think of the officers on the bridge of Samidare in those moments before the collision. They were making decisions on the assumption that other ships would be where intelligence and standing orders suggested they would be. They were watching for enemies they could not yet see, trying to position themselves to fire on silhouettes glimpsed in flashes of light, trying to avoid friendly vessels even as the compass and the fathometer and the tired eyes of young sailors were all they truly had to guide them. Then came the lurch, the scrape of steel on steel, and in that instant, you might wonder whether the collision felt to them as a violation, an intrusion of something almost obscene into the ordered chaos of combat. This was not how a captain trained his crew to fight. This was not the way navies were supposed to conduct operations. Yet it was also inevitable, woven into the fabric of what this battle was. The Americans had radar, yes, but they too had restrictions, disciplines imposed by the need to keep their formation intact. The Japanese were operating at a disadvantage, but they were still operating, still maneuvering, still determined. The waters around Bougainville that night were crowded with intent and speed and fear, compressed into a space perhaps 20 miles across, and into that space were poured enough metal and explosives and human desperation to transform an ordinary patch of tropical sea into something altogether strange and terrible. The fact that Samidare and Shiratsuyu collided and separated, that both ships managed to continue fighting despite the damage, speaks to the remarkable strength of these vessels and the resilience of their crews. But it also reminds us that in the historical record of the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, the tidy narratives we might construct, the radar advantage, the superior gunnery, the tactical brilliance, these existed alongside something far more human and far more contingent. Ships collided in the dark, not because their captains were incompetent, but because darkness itself demanded a price. Darkness bred confusion as abundantly as it bred secrecy and protection. As the battle wore on, as more ships arrived on the scene, and the area became even more crowded with vessels maneuvering at high speed, the danger of such incidents did not diminish. It only grew more acute. Men below decks, unable to see, unable to hear clearly through the roar of machinery and gunfire, could only wait and trust that the officers above them would navigate safely through this fog of metal and noise. And when a collision did occur, when that other ship suddenly appeared out of the rain and struck, what must that have felt like to those in the compartments near the impact? In an instant, you could not know if you had been hit by a shell or by your own ally. In darkness absolute, the distinction blurred. While the cruisers maintained their disciplined barrage at longer range, trading shells with the Japanese heavies in that shrouded darkness, something rather different was unfolding in the waters closer to shore. The destroyer screen, that outer ring of smaller, faster vessels meant to protect the larger ships, had begun to slip into its own separate engagement, a kind of violent dance conducted entirely among the shadows and smoke. And it is here, in these shallower, more confused waters near Empress Augusta Bay itself, that one man's tactical nerve would come to define the character of the entire night. Commander Arleigh Albert Burke, captain of the destroyer USS Charles F. Osborne and senior destroyer commander for the evening, had spent the hours before contact pacing his bridge like a man who understood exactly what was coming. Burke was, by the accounts of those who sailed with him, a particular sort of naval officer, methodical, intuitive, possessed of that rare quality that allowed him to see not just the battle as it was unfolding, but as it might unfold in the next 5 minutes. He had positioned his screen of destroyers in a way that would allow them to move with flexibility, to dart between the larger ships and the approaching enemy formation, to use their speed as a kind of knife that could slip through defenses the cruisers could not penetrate. When contact came, when that first radar blip separated itself from the general clutter on the scope and resolved into an undeniable shape, a Japanese destroyer, then another, then several more forming into a rough line, Burke made his decision with the kind of swiftness that comes from preparation. Rather than waiting passively for the enemy destroyers to come to him, he would take his screen forward, he would press toward them, close the distance rapidly, and deliver torpedo fire while the Japanese were still coordinating with their own heavier ships. It was, in many respects, the oldest tactic in destroyer warfare. But in 1943, in the dark, with radar showing the way, it had taken on new possibilities, new angles of approach. The American destroyers pushed forward through the rain and intermittent cloud, their wakes spreading white against the darker sea. There is something profoundly isolating about approaching an enemy you cannot see, can track only as a green phosphorescence on a radar screen, can hear only as reports crackling over the voice tube. The men below decks, the ones feeding ammunition to the 5-inch guns, the ones manning the fire control systems, the ones listening to sonar contacts that might be anything, a whale perhaps, or a torpedo, already in the water. They existed, in a kind of sensory deprivation, dependent entirely on the eyes and ears of the men above, and the instruments humming around them. Burke's destroyers launched their torpedoes in what they believed to be the direction of the Japanese formation, the long metal fish sliding into the dark water with a vibration that ran through the hull and was felt, rather than heard, by everyone aboard. 16, 20, perhaps more torpedoes fanned out through the night. One wonders, in the quiet hours before dawn, what it feels like to loose a weapon you will not see strike home for several minutes, if it strikes at all. The waiting during those minutes is its own kind of ordeal, its own particular species of tension. And then the guns began. The American destroyers wheeled, bringing their main batteries to bear on the Japanese destroyers, whose positions they could infer from radar returns, from the occasional muzzle flash lighting the clouds from below, from the whistle and crack of shells passing overhead. The noise at close range during a destroyer action is beyond the capacity of language to describe with adequate precision. Imagine standing inside a continuously ringing bell. Imagine the vibration of steel under sustained shock. Imagine the smell of cordite mixing with the salt air and burning oil. The gun crews worked with a kind of mechanical precision born from endless drills, load, fire, while officers on the bridge called out corrections, trying to thread their salvos through the darkness toward an enemy that was moving, maneuvering, trying to do precisely the same thing to them. One of the Japanese destroyers, the Samidare, found itself caught in the periphery of Burke's engagement, her captain suddenly aware that American destroyers were very close indeed, and very intent on making their presence felt. What happened next was one of those moments that distinguishes between tactical doctrine and the reality of battle in darkness. In maneuvering to avoid torpedo tracks he believed he had detected, or perhaps in an attempt to bring his guns to bear more effectively, the captain of the Samidare began an evasive turn that was neither coordinated with his own fleet nor communicated quickly enough to nearby vessels. The destroyer Shiratsuyu, steaming in rough formation nearby, suddenly found herself bearing down on the Samidare's stern quarter. The collision, when it came, was a kind of punctuation mark in the chaos, a grinding, tearing sound that could be heard above the continuous roar of gunfire that registered immediately on every bridge in the area as a grave problem. The Samidare's stern was crushed inward. The Shiratsuyu, though less severely damaged, was suddenly dead in the water, her screws momentarily tangled or damaged, her captain forced to consider whether to stay and fight or attempt to back clear and return to the protection of the formation. These are the sorts of decisions that admirals never have to make, but destroyer captains sometimes do. In the fog of war, and fog of war is not merely a metaphor when you are speaking of a night action in rain and smoke, two of your own ships can become as dangerous as an enemy cruiser. Perhaps more so, because you cannot anticipate their movements with the same clarity you might anticipate those of a recognized enemy. Burke pressed his advantage. More American destroyers pushed forward. More torpedo tracks crossed the black water. The Japanese destroyers, finding themselves suddenly under attack from multiple directions, from bearings that seemed to multiply even as they tried to process the intelligence being reported to them, began to fracture as a cohesive unit. Some attempted to retire, others pressed forward to engage the American guns, still others maneuvered to avoid torpedoes in patterns that grew increasingly erratic. The radar picture, as seen by both sides, was becoming crowded, confused, a tangle of green blips that took time to interpret, time that none of these men possessed in adequate measure. What was remarkable about this destroyer action, what historians of the battle have sometimes noted, is how thoroughly the American destroyers seized and maintained the initiative. Burke's decision to press forward, to compress the range, to force the engagement rather than await one, had the effect of keeping the Japanese destroyer captains perpetually off balance, perpetually reacting rather than acting. They were skilled, experienced officers, many of them, but they were operating in darkness against an enemy whose technology gave them sight in that darkness, and that imbalance, that single asymmetry, tipped what might otherwise have been a balanced fight heavily toward the American side. And throughout all of this, through the roar of the guns, the shock of near misses, the groaning of steel under stress, the desperate work of damage control parties fighting fires and flooding below decks, there was the knowledge, dim and distant but present nonetheless, that somewhere in this same darkness, somewhere in the rain and smoke, the larger battle between cruisers was still unfolding. The destroyers were fighting their own war, yes, but it was a war that mattered only insofar as it protected the battle that mattered more. It is a peculiar form of sacrifice, to do your duty, knowing that your duty is the duty of a shield, that you are meant to be between the enemy and something you are protecting, even as your own men are bleeding and dying around you. In those compressed minutes of thunder and orange fire, when the Japanese shells were coming faster than the human mind could process their arrival, the cruiser Denver found herself in a peculiar and terrifying mathematics, the problem of being a large, illuminated target, in a space where dozens of weapons were searching for exactly such a thing. A shell passed so close to her starboard side that the concussion alone, the sheer percussion of air, displaced by a projectile moving faster than sound, buckled plating, and sent men sprawling across her deck, as if an invisible hand had shoved them sideways. The near miss did no penetrating damage, created no hole below the waterline, yet the force of it rippled through the ship like a struck bell, and for several seconds after, the crew felt less like sailors aboard a vessel, and more like passengers in something that had been violently jolted. Somewhere in her engine spaces, gauge needles trembled, water sloshed in ballast tanks. A man's coffee cup, forgotten on a plotting table, slid across polished metal and fell. The cruiser Cleveland, moving perhaps 1,000 yards to the northeast, experienced her own baptism in the artless violence of surface combat. A shell meant for her passed instead through the water perhaps 200 yards away, and the waterspout that rose from its impact fell like rain across her forward superstructure, drenching the men who crouched behind gun shields and plotted coordinates in the fire control tower. Cold seawater, mixed with the smell of burning powder and hot steel, a sensory combination that the human brain imprints quickly and indelibly, the way trauma sometimes works. Officers later described a strange moment of clarity that came after that near miss, a sudden awareness of how thin the margin was between a ship remaining afloat and ceasing to exist. How quickly a peacetime routine of gunnery drills and maintenance schedules could transform into something where the only thought that mattered was the next order, the next correction, the next salvo. What is remarkable, perhaps even strange, is how humans behave when taught and trained for precisely such moments. The men aboard Denver and Cleveland, many of them young, ordinary boys from rural Wisconsin or industrial Detroit or dusty towns in Texas, had been drilled in fire discipline with an almost monastic repetition. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. In the moments when the Japanese shells were churning the sea around them, and when fear would seem a natural and understandable response, these crews maintained their rhythm. The gunnery officers spoke in voices that remained, by accounts from those who survived the night, almost eerily calm. Left 10 degrees, fire. The guns spoke in response to those words. The breech blocks slammed shut. The powder canisters were loaded by men whose hands moved through the motions, so thoroughly learned that conscious thought seemed almost irrelevant. This was, in fact, a kind of controlled panic. Though controlled, perhaps gives it too much credit for serenity. It was more accurately a managed awareness that nothing good would come from hesitation or from the luxury of truly feeling afraid. The mind has a way of compartmentalizing when survival depends on it. And so the men who crouched in the hot, powder-hazed gun turrets, and the fire control stations, and the damage control parties standing by, in case a hit came to their section, all of them found a space, somewhere between terror and function, where they could simply do the work. Yet the strain was visible to anyone who watched closely enough. A gunnery officer's voice might remain steady, but his hands might tremble slightly as he gripped the sound-powered telephone handset. A damage control petty officer might give clear orders about shoring up a bulkhead, his words precise and professional, but his jaw would be so tightly clenched that later he would feel the ache of it. The human body, even when disciplined by months of training, registers danger. The heart knows what the will attempts to deny. After the war, some of these men wrote in letters or spoke to interviewers about that curious disconnection, the part of them that remained functional and focused, and another part that was somewhere else, somewhere distant, almost observing from a remove, as if watching another person do these dangerous things. The danger was not abstract. The shells that missed Denver and Cleveland by those narrow margins were no less lethal for their failure to find their target. Each one carried within it the kinetic energy of an explosion, the potential to tear through steel and flesh, the potential to flood a compartment in seconds, or to turn a gun turret and its crew into twisted metal and ash. The fact that they missed was not a reprieve, but merely a deferral, or so it seemed in those moments, when the rate of fire from both sides seemed to suggest that the night would never end, that the bombardment would continue until either the ships sank or the ammunition ran out, whichever came first. And there was, in the midst of all this fury, a kind of strange beauty in how the American cruisers conducted their fire. The radar-directed salvos, coordinated through voice circuits and plotting tables, gave their gunnery an almost geometric precision even in the chaos. Where the Japanese gunnery was brilliant in flashes, concentrated, desperate, aimed at sinking ships quickly, the American approach was more methodical. Load, calculate, fire, wait for the splash to tell you whether you had the range, adjust, fire again. It was the difference between inspiration and system, and in the long run, systems tend to win. But in the short run, in that compressed hour where the outcome remained genuinely uncertain, the guns roared and the shells fell, and the men aboard the American cruisers endured the peculiar strain of doing their duty while surrounded by forces seeking their destruction. In the rolling turmoil of shell bursts and the stuttering orange light of guns firing blind through the smoke and rain, something happened to the Japanese flagship Myoko that no amount of tactical brilliance could have prevented. A collision born not of enemy action, but of the very darkness that had become both shield and executioner for every vessel on that black water. Admiral Omori was aboard the Myoko, a heavy cruiser that had survived countless campaigns in the Pacific, her steel hull scarred with the marks of prior engagements, her crew seasoned in the terrible ballet of night warfare. She was moving through the chaos with her screens of destroyers scattered around her, each captain trying to maintain formation while tracking multiple contacts on the frantic radio channels, trying to distinguish friend from foe in a night so thick with smoke and sea spray that visibility collapsed to mere yards in places. The rain came and went in sheets, and the illumination shells that burst overhead cast everything in a sickly, shifting glow that made distance impossible to judge. Somewhere in that confusion, the destroyer Hatsukaze, one of Omori's own escort vessels, found herself drifting into the Myoko's path. In the normal rhythms of daylight, a destroyer captain would have seen the flagship's bulk looming ahead and altered course with plenty of margin. But this was not daylight. This was a world reduced to ghostly silhouettes and sudden revelations, where the glow of a burning ship or the flash of distant guns might be 2,000 yards away or 200. The Hatsukaze's bridge crew, managing their own evasions and trying to track the American cruisers that seemed to materialize and vanish in the murk, simply did not see the Myoko until it was far too late. The collision, when it came, was a grinding, sickening crunch of steel on steel, a moment of terrible, grinding contact that was almost worse in its implications than a direct hit from an enemy shell. A shell at least you could understand as the cost of battle, the price of meeting the enemy in combat. But this was an accident brought about by the very conditions of the engagement, a collision that should never have happened if only visibility had been clearer, if only the radio channels had been less congested, if only one captain had turned a few degrees sooner. It was the fog of war made manifest in the collision of two Allied warships. The damage was significant but not fatal. Both vessels sustained crushing blows to their hulls, and damage control teams rushed through the Myoko's compartments fighting fires and shoring up bulkheads, their flashlights cutting through choking smoke as they moved with trained urgency through the darkness below decks. The Hatsukaze, struck in a place that compromised her seaworthiness, would need to limp northward under her own power, trailing smoke and concern. For both ships, precious moments and attention had been diverted from the battle raging around them, from the American cruisers whose salvos were becoming more accurate as their radar operators gained confidence in their targeting solutions. What makes this collision particularly poignant, particularly reflective of the terror and confusion of night surface action, is how utterly meaningless it was in the grand scheme of tactics. It changed nothing about the battle's trajectory, did not alter Omori's eventual decision to withdraw, did not save the Sendai, or spare any ship that was destined to be lost to American gunnery. And yet it stands as a reminder that naval combat in darkness was not some orderly chess game played out against the backdrop of radar screens and fire control computers. It was chaos wrapped in discipline, calculation overlaid with chance, and for all the technological advances the Japanese had brought to the Pacific War, their ships were still made of steel that could crumple against other steel, still captained by men working with imperfect information in conditions that made the simple act of maintaining formation seem heroic. The Miyoko would continue fighting through the night, her guns still contributing to the battle, her crew still managing the constant demands of combat. But that collision, that moment when her own flagship struck her own destroyer in the darkness, was almost like a metaphor for the night's entire progression, a chaos that no amount of courage or skill could fully contain, where victory and disaster both seemed to arrive almost by accident, where the enemy was as much the darkness and confusion as the ships firing guns on the opposite side of the night. Through the chaos of burning cordite and the shock waves that rippled across the water, something was beginning to shift in favor of the Americans. Quietly at first, then with gathering momentum, the radar operators aboard the Montpelier, hunched before their green screens in the dim combat information center, had learned something crucial in those first desperate minutes of contact. They were not merely watching blips move across glass. They were reading the geometry of an unfolding battle with a clarity that no searchlight or human eye could match in that rain-swept darkness. Each radar pulse that returned to the antenna told a story of distance, direction, and the movement of steel through black water. The illumination shells began their upward arc into the November sky, those peculiar, almost theatrical projectiles that American gunners had learned to employ with devastating precision. They burst overhead in chains of brilliant white light, hanging suspended like artificial moons, and in their glow, the Japanese fleet lost something essential, the advantage of obscurity. The darkness that had cloaked their approach, that had made them equal in terms of what they could see and what they could strike, suddenly became a stage upon which their ships were silhouetted. What might have happened, one wonders, if radar had not yet been perfected? If American ships that night had relied solely on searchlights and the straining eyes of lookouts? The Japanese Navy, after all, had pursued a different philosophy. Their officers prided themselves on night-fighting prowess, born from years of training, from an almost spiritual approach to the art of surface combat in darkness. Yet that philosophy, however noble and however rooted in genuine expertise, had not accounted for a technology that transformed night into something that could be read, measured, and exploited by a generation of young American officers who had grown up studying charts and mathematics rather than sword technique. The American cruisers, with this invisible advantage working in their favor, began to make deliberate adjustments to their course and speed. Merrill's orders, transmitted quietly through the flagship systems, sent his ships gliding into positions that felt, to the commanders executing them, almost uncomfortably predictable, as if they were walking into a box that the Japanese might be preparing to close. Yet the mathematics never lied. The radar told them where the enemy ships were, told them the angles at which their own guns should be trained, told them precisely when to open fire so that the salvos would arrive not at where the Japanese ships had been, but where they were going. The initial salvos from the American cruisers had been somewhat wild, finding their aim through trial and adjustment, through the ancient dance of gunnery and combat. But now, with illumination shells burning above, and with the steadier information flowing from the radar sets below decks, something closer to true gunnery was becoming possible. The guns were speaking with a voice that carried real weight. The shells that left the American gun barrels were being guided by science as much as by instinct, and they began, one by one, in patterns that accumulated into something devastating, to find their marks. The Japanese light cruiser Sendai, already wounded from earlier exchanges and struggling to maintain formation, seemed to absorb an extraordinary concentration of American fire. The shells that struck her came without warning, because radar had dictated their trajectory in real time, and by the time the Sendai's gun crews understood what was happening, the damage was already compounding. The steel of her hull was being transformed into something else, into fragments, into obstacles to the blood and motion of survival. The Sendai was crippled, truly crippled now, and her captain knew with a certainty that needed no explanation that his ship was no longer going to carry him and his men home through these waters. Aboard the American cruisers, Despite the discipline and the controlled chaos that characterized naval combat, there was something like confidence beginning to settle into the consciousness of the crews. The radar operators saw it first, the way the enemy formations were becoming increasingly scattered, increasingly defensive. The gun crews felt it in the rhythm of loading and firing, in the way each salvo now seemed to have a purpose and a probable outcome. The officers directing the action felt it most keenly. This transition from desperate improvisation to something approaching tactical mastery. The smoke that hung over the water, thick from the burning ships and the thousands of shells that had been fired, should have been an advantage to the Japanese. Smoke meant concealment. Smoke meant that the Americans would be firing partially blind, would be reduced to the same level of uncertainty as their enemies. Yet the smoke, in a strange reversal, had become almost irrelevant. The radar saw through it as easily as a person sees through glass. The illumination shells hung above it, lighting the water and the ships below, and the American gunnery, guided by the invisible hands of officers reading green screens far below the waterline, continued its methodical work of destruction. The destroyer escort screen, those smaller but nimble ships that had been weaving between the cruisers and the larger vessels of Omori's fleet, found themselves increasingly harassed by American fire that seemed to know exactly where they were going. Near misses sent up geysers of water that drenched the decks, that reached toward the Japanese sailors as if trying to pull them into the sea. The shock waves, even when the shells did not directly strike home, were enough to rattle rivets, to shake the confidence of men who had been taught that they were masters of their element. And perhaps most significantly, the American fire discipline was holding. There were no panic salvos now, no wild expenditures of ammunition born from fear and uncertainty. The rate of fire was measured, purposeful, almost economical in its precision. Each shell that left an American gun had been aimed with the full weight of technological superiority and tactical understanding behind it. And so, in that grey chaos, amid the thunder of guns that seemed to shake the very sea itself, Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori found himself in a position no commander ever welcomes. The carefully planned raid from Rabaul, this swift descent into Empress Augusta Bay to scatter the American invasion force, had not unfolded as the charts and radio signals suggested it would. What had begun as a controlled counterpunch had become something far more uncertain, far more costly than anticipated. The Japanese flagship Miyoko, powerful and proud, had already felt American shells tear through her hull. The light cruiser Sendai, that graceful warship, had been crippled beyond any hope of fighting her way home, her crew struggling in waters that seemed to pull her down with each passing minute. And those destroyers, where were all those destroyers now? In the darkness and the smoke and the constant churn of maneuvering through rain squalls that rolled across the bay like living things, the formation had become scattered, fractured. Omori could not see all his ships. The men in the Miyoko's fire control centers, straining over their instruments, could not guarantee that every signal sent would be heard by every captain. There was no clean command here anymore. There was only the growing sense that the night was turning against him. Consider for a moment what that realization must have felt like. Here was a man trained in the Japanese Navy's tradition, a career officer who had studied tactics and precedent, who understood that the sea had always been Japan's highway and the surface fleet her sword. Yet the Americans, with their radar that his intelligence officers had warned about, but that he could not quite see or touch, were placing their shells with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. They were finding targets in darkness where targets could not possibly be seen, and his own ships, with all their courage and gunnery skill, were struggling to answer in kind. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, as the battle had raged for perhaps 40 minutes in its most intense form, Omori made the decision. It was not, by any measure, a retreat born of cowardice or panic. It was a tactical judgment, a recognition that the situation had become untenable. The cruisers and destroyers around him were damaged, scattered, and unable to achieve the concentration of force that might yet turn this engagement. The light forces were performing their duties with bravery, but the mathematics of the battle, that cold calculation that commanders must make in the midst of chaos, were no longer favorable. The order went out from the Myoko. It rippled through the fleet, passed by signal light and radio, reaching the ears of captains and executive officers in the darkness. The Japanese task force would retire northward. They would withdraw from Empress Augusta Bay and proceed back toward Rabaul. The raid was over. What followed was perhaps its own kind of ordeal. As the Japanese ships began to disengage and turn north, they had to navigate not just away from the Americans, but through the same rain squalls that had obscured everything for the past hour. The darkness was absolute in places, the rain so thick that a ship 50 yards distant became invisible. Men on the bridges of cruisers and destroyers strained to see the shapes of their own vessels, trying to maintain formation while also trying to put distance between themselves and the enemy. You can imagine the exhaustion in those moments, the release of tension that comes with the knowledge that you are no longer facing direct cannon fire, coupled immediately with the danger of the sea itself, which cares nothing for national allegiances or tactical situations. The Japanese destroyers, some of them damaged, some of them still trying to respond to orders, began their northward run. Minegumo and Yugiri, Shiratsuyu and the others, those that remained undamaged or only lightly struck, picked up speed as best they could. The Myoko, despite her wounds, began to move. Haguro, the heavy cruiser that had fought so hard against the American line, also turned away, and gradually, so gradually that it was almost as if the darkness itself was swallowing them, the Japanese force began to vanish from the theater of battle. The Americans watched them go. There is a particular sensation in watching an enemy retreat, especially after hours of intense engagement. It is not quite relief, because the danger is not entirely gone, the night is still dark, there are still other threats, and the battle may not be over, but it is something close to it. The radar operators in Task Force 39 reported the Japanese bearing steadily away. The gunnery officers, whose hands were steady from training and adrenaline in equal measure, tracked the departing ships, and then, as the range increased and the rain continued to thicken, the visual contact that had never truly existed became even more impossible. The radar blips moved north, the Japanese were leaving, the main surface engagement of the night was ending. What had it been, this contest in the darkness? 45 minutes of concentrated naval action, perhaps an hour if you counted the earlier maneuvering and approaches. In that time, thousands of tons of steel had been set in motion, hundreds of shells had been fired, and in the waters around Empress Augusta Bay, men were dying, some instantly, some struggling in the cold water, some already sinking toward depths they would never fully fathom. The human cost of this withdrawal would be counted in the days to come, in casualty lists and letters that would arrive at homes in Japan and America, in young men who would never return from the Solomon Islands. But in that moment, as Omori's ships disappeared into the rain and the night, the question hanging over the engagement was simply this: what had been prevented? The American landings at Cape Torokina, those young Marines and soldiers coming ashore that day, they would not face the onslaught of Japanese naval artillery that this task force might have delivered. The supply lines to that beachhead would remain in American hands. The step northward toward Rabaul would not be halted. And all of this because Omori had chosen to withdraw rather than fight on in a battle he could no longer control. The radar screens in Task Force 39 showed the Japanese ships moving steadily away. The gun crews, still tense, still wary, gradually eased their grip on their levers and controls. There would be no more firing now, not yet anyway. The night itself seemed to settle into a different rhythm, as if the violence had passed through it like a fever breaking, leaving behind exhaustion and the slow realization that dawn was still hours away, and that whatever else might happen, this particular contest between Omori and Merrill was finished. As the first grey light began to touch the eastern horizon that morning of November 2nd, something else was stirring in the air far to the north. At the Japanese base at Rabaul, on New Britain, officers were receiving word of the night's disaster in Empress Augusta Bay. The Japanese naval force, battered and withdrawing, had failed to dislodge the American beachhead, but there remained one more weapon in their arsenal, one that had been devastating throughout the Long Island campaign: aircraft. Dozens of them, bombers and fighters fueled and armed, waiting on the tarmac as dawn broke over the volcanic landscape. By the time the sun itself appeared above the horizon, casting long shadows across the waters where Task Force 39 was still maintaining its protective screen around the transport vessels and the thousands of Marines now dug in ashore, Japanese planes were already in the air. Wave after wave lifted off from Rabaul's airfields, perhaps more than 100 aircraft altogether. Dive bombers, level bombers, fighters too, all heading south toward the task force that had just fought through the darkness and now found itself vulnerable in the gathering daylight. Admiral Merrill's ships were exhausted. Gunners were depleted. Some vessels bore fresh battle damage, and yet the task ahead was far from over. But there existed one crucial advantage that the Japanese had not fully anticipated. Alongside the task force, providing constant vigilance from above, were American fighter squadrons. They came from the newly arrived light carriers that had been operating in these waters, their Hellcats and other fighters already airborne or racing down the flight deck toward the sky. These American pilots, many of them fresh to the theater but trained relentlessly, understood what was coming. They had received word from the radar operators below that enemy formations were inbound. The question became not whether the Japanese could attack, but rather whether the American air defense could blunt the assault enough to save the ships below. What unfolded across the morning hours was something almost like a hidden ballet of violence and survival, played out above the grey waters and the steel hulls of the task force. The first Japanese aircraft appeared as distant specks, then as recognizable shapes. The American fighters rose to meet them. The engagement was not a single concentrated dogfight, but rather a series of encounters spread across miles of sky, a constant choreography of climbing and diving, pursuit and evasion, bursts of machine gun fire, visible even in daylight, trails of smoke from damaged engines, aircraft spiraling downward. The Japanese had numerical advantage. They always did in the early hours of any coordinated air assault. But the Americans had something equally valuable. They had home field advantage, in a manner of speaking. The fighters did not need to fly far to reach the battle. They could engage, withdraw to rearm and refuel, and return to the fight in a cycle that the distant Japanese could not match. Moreover, the coordination was crucial. Radio traffic crackled between fighter squadrons and the ships below, guiding the pilots toward incoming threats. Ground control from the task force, using radar data, was feeding information to the fighters about where to position themselves for maximum effectiveness. One might wonder, in the quietness of these moments, how many individual combats were occurring simultaneously across the sky. How many pilots, American and Japanese alike, were executing their training in those desperate hours, their reactions honed by months of practice, now being tested against genuine threat. The Japanese pilots were experienced, many of them veterans of months or years of combat. The American pilots were fresher to the war, but increasingly skilled. In every encounter, the outcome hung on fractions of a second, on split-second decisions, on the reliability of one's aircraft and the steadiness of one's nerve. Below, on the decks of the cruisers and destroyers, the crews watched and waited. Anti-aircraft guns were manned, crews standing ready at every battery. The ships maneuvered constantly, changing course and speed to avoid bombs that were now beginning to fall. Some Japanese aircraft broke through the fighter screen. It was inevitable. Despite the best efforts of the American pilots above, some enemy bombers managed to press their attacks. Explosions erupted across the water. Splashes from near misses showered the decks with salt spray. The noise was constant, overwhelming, the roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, the distant sound of bombs whistling down through air. Yet the remarkable fact was this: the fighter cover held. It did not prevent all damage, but it prevented catastrophe. The Japanese had launched an assault that, in earlier stages of the war, might have crippled or sunk several ships. Instead, the Americans weathered it. A few ships took hits. Some sustained damage from near misses, but the task force remained intact. The transports, which were particularly vulnerable, were largely protected. The Marines ashore received no reinforcement from the sea that day, but neither did they face a renewed naval bombardment. The Japanese air attack, despite its ferocity and the courage of its participants, had failed to achieve its objective. As the morning wore on, the tempo of the air attacks gradually diminished. The Japanese air arm, having expended significant resources in the assault, began to withdraw. Some aircraft returned to Rabaul, their bombs spent or their ammunition exhausted. Others did not return at all. They had been shot down by American fighters, their crews perishing over water thousands of miles from home. By midday, the sky above the task force had quieted. The fighters continued to patrol, but no new waves of Japanese aircraft appeared. The immediate threat had passed. It is worth pausing here to reflect on what had been accomplished in these hours of aerial combat. The American fighter pilots, working in coordination with the task force below, had managed something that seemed increasingly important as the campaign in the Pacific progressed. They had shifted the balance of naval air power. For so long, Japanese pilots had dominated the skies wherever they chose to contest them. But now, with new aircraft types becoming available, and with American pilots gaining experience and confidence, the tide was turning. The battle above Empress Augusta Bay on the morning of November 2nd represented another step in that long, grinding transition. The cost, of course, was measured in lives. American pilots who did not return from their patrols, Japanese pilots who crashed into the sea or ejected, only to drift alone in the vastness of the ocean. In the aftermath of any air engagement, there were always those moments of silence and grief, of names read off and recorded, of empty chairs at evening meals. But from a strategic and tactical perspective, the American defense had succeeded. The task force had been preserved. The beachhead ashore would receive no decisive blow from the air, and the momentum of the American advance up the Solomon Islands chain remained unbroken. And yet beneath all the calculations of gunnery, the radar vectors, the tactical maneuvers that would later fill the history books with neat explanations and arrows on faded maps, beneath every decision made by admiral and captain in those luminous moments of combat, lay something far more fragile and entirely human. The men, young men most of them, who had signed aboard the USS Denver or the Montpelier or any of a dozen other ships with their fresh-pressed uniforms and their letters sealed in their pockets, addressed to mothers and wives and sweethearts, they wondered if they would see again. When the Japanese cruiser Sendai took her fatal volley and began her slow descent into the black waters off Cape Torokina, she carried more than just naval history downward. The men who couldn't reach the railings in time, who found themselves in compartments rapidly filling with seawater and oil and smoke, who felt the deck tilt beneath them in that terrible silence that comes just before the final plunge. They had been talking about home only hours before. Conversations about what they would eat first when the war ended. Jokes about girls waiting in towns they could barely remember now. The small, tender mercies of human thought when facing the vast indifference of the sea. The waters off Empress Augusta Bay that night became a kind of dark threshold. Some men were pulled aboard the rescue destroyers, coughing and shivering, their skins slicked with fuel oil that burned their eyes and clung to them like a second skin. Others drifted in the wreckage, calling out in the darkness, their voices swallowed almost immediately by the noise of continuing battle, by the rumble of gunfire echoing down from the north where Merrill's cruisers still hammered at the retreating Japanese. The destroyer screens, even in their own desperate moments, found themselves hunting through the water for survivors, their crews leaning over railings with boat hooks and cargo nets, pulling men aboard who had seen things they would never quite speak of afterward. One crew member from the Cleveland, who had survived a near miss that sent splinters the size of railway spikes through the superstructure, later described the sound, not of the explosion itself, but of the moments after, the strange whistling as air moved through newly opened gaps in the hull, the calls for damage control, the the smell of burning insulation and hot metal. He wrote of watching the men around him with a kind of wonder, noting how they moved not with the heroic certainty of recruitment posters, but with a focused, almost dull determination. They had jobs to do. There was an enemy to fight. And so they did what they had been trained to do, though their hands trembled slightly on the handles of ammunition hoists, and their minds kept slipping sideways to thoughts of places very far away. The rescue efforts continued well after the gunfire ceased. In the grey light before full dawn, the sea was calmer, almost gentle, as though it were offering a moment of reprieve. Small boats picked through the scattered debris, wooden crates, pieces of hull plating, the detritus of violence, searching for men who had survived the hours in the water. Some had been afloat for what felt like an eternity, though it was only a few hours. Others were found too late. The sea, it seems, keeps its own accounts. What emerges from the letters and reports that came back from the battle, days or weeks later, when men could finally put pen to paper with steady enough hands, is a sense of profound exhaustion. Not the simple tiredness of a long day, but something deeper, a weariness of the nervous system, of having stared into darkness so complete that the mind begins to invent shapes within it. One ensign, who had been stationed in a gun director on the Montpelier, wrote to his mother that he had seen the Japanese ships only as green blips on a radar screen, and somehow that made them both more and less real. More, because the destruction they inflicted was entirely concrete and irrefutable. Less, because he had never glimpsed an actual face, an actual human being. Had he killed anyone that night? He would never know. The question, he wrote, seemed both important and utterly meaningless in equal measure. The pharmacist's mates worked through the dawn hours, tending to burned men with shrapnel wounds, men who had swallowed seawater and fuel oil, and who were now being sick into buckets while their hands shook. The officers who had commanded the guns, who had made the split-second decisions about when to fire and when to hold, they moved through the day in a kind of numb haze, their eyes hollow. One captain noted in his log that he had not properly blinked, for what must have been 5 or 6 hours. Everything looked slightly unreal. The colours seemed wrong. There were men who had lost their closest friends in the darkness. In the chaos of a night action, you might find yourself in a compartment that was suddenly filling with water, separated from the man who had slept in the bunk next to you for the past 18 months, by nothing more substantial than a sealed door. You might be pulled to safety while he was not. The guilt of that, in the days and weeks that followed, proved to be a wound that had no salve. Letters home often carried a kind of apologetic tone, as though the writer was somehow responsible for having survived when others had not. It was irrational, of course. But war, in its grinding way, is often highly irrational. The human mind, it must be noted, is capable of extraordinary adaptation. Sailors who had weathered the night action moved through the next day almost as though it had been a dream, a particularly vivid nightmare that had dissolved with the coming of full light. Yet the small tremors persisted. A coffee cup would shake slightly in someone's hand. A loud noise on the ship would cause men to flinch and crouch instinctively. These were the marks that battle leaves on people, the invisible scars that no dressing station could treat. Some of the survivors of Japanese ships, the men who had been pulled from the water or who had clung to floating debris through the long night, were taken aboard American vessels as prisoners. There is something profoundly moving in the accounts of those encounters. Exhausted, frightened young Japanese sailors being wrapped in blankets and given hot coffee by American sailors who had been shooting at them only hours before. One American destroyer crewman wrote that he looked into the face of a Japanese prisoner and saw his own twin staring back at him, the same fear, the same confusion, the same desperate gratitude at still being alive. What was the war, really, he wondered, if not an elaborate mechanism for turning men who had nothing against each other into killers and victims alike? The letters home that made it through the military post system in the weeks following the battle carry a particular poignancy, reading them now in the quiet of modern times. The men tried to explain to their families what had happened, and found that the experience resisted translation into language. How do you tell your mother that you spent 6 hours in complete darkness listening to men die? How do you convey to your wife that you are not quite the same person who left home, that something has been subtly altered in you, in the way you see light and darkness, in the way you flinch at sudden sounds? Many of the letters simply trailed off, incomplete, as though the writer had run out of the capacity to articulate anything further. There was also, beneath the exhaustion and trauma, a strange species of pride. The men of Task Force 39 had faced an enemy force with confidence, and they had prevailed. The American gunnery had been superior. The tactical decisions made by Merrill and his commanders had been sound. In the aftermath, in the days when the ship was being provisioned and repaired, men spoke of the action with a kind of bewildered amazement. They had been tested in the most extreme possible way, and they had not failed. It was a thought to hold on to, in the long nights that followed, when sleep did not come easily, and the mind kept replaying moments from the battle, imagining slightly different outcomes, slightly different circumstances. What had transpired in those few hours of violent darkness, though costly and exhausting, had quietly shifted the entire balance of power across the South Pacific. The Americans had held the waters off Empress Augusta Bay when it mattered most, and in doing so, they had secured something far larger than a single night's engagement. Bougainville itself, with its landing beaches at Cape Torquay, now firmly occupied by thousands of Marines, would remain in Allied hands. The Japanese would not dislodge them, the beachhead would grow, and from it, airfields would soon rise into the tropical sky, bringing American fighters and bombers within striking distance of targets they had only dreamed of reaching before. Consider for a moment what that meant for the broader sweep of the war. The Solomon Islands, that long spine of volcanic islands stretching southeastward from Rabaul like vertebrae in a spine, had been the principal highway of Japanese expansion into the South Pacific. They had held them with fierce determination, and yet, one by one, the Americans had pushed northward through them. Guadalcanal, the New Georgias, and now Bougainville itself. Each island captured meant another stepping stone placed on the path toward the enemy's heartland. Rabaul, that formidable fortress on New Britain, had once seemed almost unreachable, a distant symbol of Japanese might. Now, with the Americans ensconced on Bougainville, the isolation of Rabaul had begun in earnest. The air power that had once seemed to emanate inexhaustibly from Rabaul's twin harbors would soon find itself increasingly hemmed in, cut off from reinforcement and supply. Japanese aircraft could still fly south from those bases, and they would, but with each passing week, they would do so with less hope of achieving sustained dominance. The margin was shifting. American aircraft, now operating from closer and closer bases, could spend more time over their targets and less time traveling to reach them. They could carry heavier loads, loiter longer, and return home with fuel to spare. The mathematics of air power had begun to favor the Allies, and it was the night action at Empress Augusta Bay, for all its confusion and bloodshed, that had helped secure the ground upon which this transformation would rest. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the quieter significance of naval battles like this one. They rarely capture the public imagination the way the great carrier actions do, those distant exchanges of bombs and torpedoes between ships that never see one another. The Battle of the Coral Sea, or the Battle of Midway, these names resound through history with a particular glamour. Yet the night battles, the surface engagements fought at close quarters in darkness and smoke, these served a different but no less vital purpose. They maintained control of the waters themselves, and from control of the waters flowed the ability to move armies, to resupply isolated garrisons, to deny the enemy the same freedoms. Empress Augusta Bay had been exactly such a battle, and its victory, though narrow and hard won, had been precisely what was needed, at precisely the moment it was needed. The Japanese, for their part, understood what had happened. Admiral Omori's retreat northward, the loss of the Sendai and other vessels damaged beyond easy repair, the failure to disrupt or reverse the American landings, all of this registered as a defeat. Not a catastrophe, not yet, but a defeat nonetheless. The Japanese Navy was learning, as all navies must learn in modern warfare, that the side which controls the supporting infrastructure, the supply lines, the airfields, and the reinforcement routes would ultimately prevail over the side which fights in isolation. Rabaul was already becoming increasingly isolated. Each lost ship, each departed pilot who did not return, meant fewer defenders for the next engagement. The American strategy, though not always clearly articulated in the grand strategic briefings, was fundamentally sound. Push north, establish new bases, degrade the enemy's ability to concentrate force, and wait for industrial capacity and manpower to overwhelm a foe already stretched thin. Bougainville, secured by the night action at Empress Augusta Bay, would serve as one of those new bases. Within weeks, Seabees and Army engineers would carve airfields from the jungle. Within months, fighters and bombers would be operating from those fields, extending the reach of American air power northward and westward. The box around Rabaul would tighten. The Japanese garrison there, once a symbol of invulnerability, would find itself increasingly unable to project power beyond its immediate vicinity. Ships sent south on supply missions would have to fight their way through American-controlled waters. Aircraft dispatched to attack Allied positions would do so with fewer and fewer escorts, less and less certainty of return. The isolation was not sudden or catastrophic in any single moment, but rather a gradual, inexorable process of erosion. What had occurred during that night of November 2nd and 3rd, then, was not merely a tactical victory for the Americans, though it was certainly that. It was a strategic turning point, though such things are often only recognized long after the fact, when historians have had time to trace the consequences through subsequent months and years. The road to Rabaul's neutralization began that night. The circumvallation, the encirclement of Japan's great fortress in the southwest Pacific, had begun with the gunfire and torpedoes of Task Force 39 under Admiral Merrill's command. Mori had sailed south hoping to prevent such a circumvallation, to keep the waters open, to disrupt the American plan. He had failed. In his failure lay the seeds of what would come next. The human exhaustion evident in the messages and reports sent in the hours after the battle took its own kind of toll. Men who had fought through the night in the confined spaces of warships, who had manned guns and engines and fire control systems, while never seeing their enemy except through the haze of smoke and the green glow of radar screens, these men had accomplished something their superiors would only fully understand in retrospect. They had purchased, with their vigilance and their willingness to endure the uncertainty of night combat, the safety of the beachhead at Cape Torokina. They had made possible the future airfields. They had begun the long process of squeezing Japan's outposts in the South Pacific. The war would go on for many more months, many more campaigns, many more losses, but Bougainville, defended that night, would be a home base for the final phases of the drive northward. It is a curious thing how history sometimes hinges on moments that few who lived through them could have fully comprehended at the time. The captains and admirals issued orders, the crews executed them, and by morning, with the sun rising over seas that seemed almost peaceful in comparison to the chaos of darkness, a new reality had begun to take shape. The isolation of Rabaul was underway. The American advance would continue. The balance of power in the South Pacific, which had seemed so precariously balanced, had begun to tip decisively in one direction, all because, one night, two fleets had met in the dark, off an island few people had heard of, and one fleet had prevailed. As the first light of November 2nd broke across the waters of Empress Augusta Bay, the rain began to thin. The violence that had filled the night, the flash of guns, the cries of men in oil-dark water, the shock of metal meeting metal in the dark, all of it receded now like a tide pulling back from shore. The American task force, battered but intact, held the sea, and slowly, as dawn fully came, the waters around them began to still. The fleet moved homeward in loose formation, their engines settling into a steady rhythm that had nothing of haste in it. Men who had stood at general quarters for hours, their hands trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, finally allowed themselves to sit. Some found their way to the lower decks, where the air was thick and warm. Others remained topside, watching the grey-green water smooth itself out as the storm clouds drifted away. The salt spray that had stung faces all through the night now carried only the smell of open ocean, that ancient perfume that asks nothing of the men who breathe it but presence. On the bridge of the Montpelier, Rear Admiral Merrill stood for a moment without speaking, looking out across water that was now beginning to show the pale colors of early morning. The radar screens behind him still glowed with their ghostly green light, but there was nothing on them now but friendly contacts and the phosphorescent traces of sea return that meant only water and distance. He thought, perhaps, of the Japanese officers aboard the Miyoko, now limping northward through the same waters, their ship carrying scars from American shellfire that would take months to repair. He thought of the Sendai, sinking beneath those waves with so many of her crew. He thought of the decisions made in darkness, some of them correct, some of them fortunate. The crews of the American destroyers gathered on deck in small, quiet groups. These men had experienced the strange disorientation of night action, the way battle in darkness strips away all sense of scale and distance, making a destroyer feel like a planet unto itself, spinning alone through an infinite black. They had fired their guns at shadows. They had heard the thunder of shells passing overhead. They had seen the sea light up in the glare of burning ships. And now, as the morning grew clearer, they could barely believe it was real. The sun climbed higher, and the enormity of what they had survived seemed to grow with it. In the sick bays below decks, corpsmen moved between the wounded with gentle hands. Some of the men would recover, some would carry scars, visible or hidden, for the rest of their lives. A sailor from Denver lay in a bunk with bandages across his ribs, wondering if he would ever feel completely whole again. Another, below decks on Cleveland, had lost hearing in one ear from the concussive blast of the 5-inch guns he had served for hours without relief. These were the costs that no official account would capture with full precision. The small, broken things in the bodies of men who had done their duty in the dark. And yet there was something in the morning light that seemed to soften the memory of it all. The human mind, in the gentle hours after stress, does something merciful. It does not forget, but it transforms. The terror becomes courage. The confusion becomes complexity. The loss becomes a kind of meaning. The sailors moving about their ships in the growing daylight already felt this transformation beginning. They were exhausted, yes. Their hands shook when they held coffee cups. Some of them would have nightmares for months or years, but they were alive. They had held the line. They had kept the seas. The fleet steamed slowly westward, putting distance between itself and Empress Augusta Bay. The waters behind them were their waters now, for the moment at least. The Marines ashore at Cape Torokina could sleep without fear of bombardment from Japanese cruisers. The amphibious operation, which had seemed so fragile in the pre-dawn darkness, was now secure. Rabaul, still many miles to the northwest, would grow weaker with each passing day. The Japanese Navy would never recover from the losses it had sustained in the Solomon Islands campaign. This night, though small in the grand architecture of the war, had been a thread in the larger weaving of American victory. A breeze moved across the water, cooling the faces of men who had stood in the heat of the engine rooms. The ships cut smoothly through seas that were now becoming almost peaceful. The horizon, which had seemed to compress and darken during the night battle, now opened up again into the familiar vault of sky and water. Somewhere above, if one could have seen it from that perspective, the fleet would have looked small, a few ships among the vastness of the Pacific. But to the men aboard those ships, the world contained nothing else. The sun continued its slow climb. The morning was becoming genuinely warm now, and some of the men removed their helmets, running their hands through sweat-dampened hair. The smell of salt and engine oil and smoke began, gradually, to fade. The smell of strong coffee rose from the galleys below. Men were being fed again. Officers were writing reports in quiet cabins, trying to find words that would somehow capture the experience of moving through darkness at 30 knots, unable to see anything but your own ship and the radar screen that showed you the shape of an invisible enemy. There was a kind of peace settling over the task force now, not the peace of victory celebrated, but something more subtle and deeper. It was the peace of work completed, of danger passed through, of mourning after a terrible night. The men who had fought in that darkness, who had made split-second decisions and accepted the possibility of their own death, were learning something that soldiers and sailors have learned since time immemorial, that the morning always comes, and that the world, no matter what has happened in the dark, still turns, still warms, still offers its light again to those who have survived to see it. The fleet continued on its course. Behind them, the waters of Empress Augusta Bay lay calm and empty in the growing daylight. The battle was over. The story of it would be told in dispatches and reports, would be studied and analyzed, would become a footnote in the larger history of the Pacific War. But for the men aboard these ships, steaming slowly homeward through waters that were becoming almost impossibly peaceful, the most important story was this. They had lived through the night. They had done their duty, and now they were heading home. The morning light spread across the water in bands of pale gold and silver. The ships moved forward with no urgency now, only the steady progress of engines that had not failed them. Above, the sky was clearing into blue. No planes came,